This week on the show, I take over, and we've got some of the best moments from 2016 in the place to be SD. BSD Now, the holiday edition. Hi, folks. I'm your host, Chris, and I'm sitting in for Chris Moore and Alan Jude to give them the week off so they can have time with the families. And I'm going to go through some of the best of BSD Now in 2016. Now, I don't know if I could really say it's fair to call it the best, but it's some of the moments we wanted to reshare with you, like this moment when Leo Laporte landed on BSD.
So anyway, the big news was that Leo Laporte has tried FreeBSD and posted about it up on his blog there, which if you don't know, he's formerly of Tech TV and now of Twit TV, is now switching to FreeBSD. So tell us a little bit about this, Alan. Yeah. What prompted this?
Well, so apparently his Windows computer decided to force upgrade itself to Windows 10. And he decided enough of that.
Oops.
So he said, yeah, the latest debacle over the forced upgrade to Windows 10 and Apple's increasingly locked-in ecosystem has got me thinking, do I really need to use a proprietary operating system to get work done? And while I'm at it, do I need to use commercial cloud services to store my data?
No.
Exactly. He's been a sometimes Linux user since the mid-90s, and, he still actually has his laptop is Linux. But when he was building his workstation, he's like, well, I want serious storage. And, what better operating system to deal with serious storage than FreeBSD?
It was EFS, yes, of course.
Yeah, he says, but as time went by, even Ubuntu seemed to be too commercial for him, he says. And so he says, now... for the grand experiment. Is it possible, I wonder, to do everything I need to do on an even more venerable, more robust system, a true Unix OS, FreeBSD? And he, smartly, for some of the switching, he actually made a list of the things he needs to be able to do. And so his requirements were that he wants something that's stable, that works even after updates. It's like, well, FreeBSD is good at that. I've upgraded my FreeBSD 6.0 machine in place all the way to 10.3 using FreeBSD update, one step at a time as I went through the years, and it's been perfect the whole way.
Sure.
He says security, no viruses, no exploits, no snoops or spooks, especially now with Windows having so much silent stuff happening and so on.
The one thing, just give me a moment to vent here. On Windows 10, which is what I use for the Skype here for production, it just really annoys me that I have to get advertisements on the right-hand side. Like, try Office. Have you tried our other product? Like, come on. Does that need to be just built into the operating system? Okay, rant over. Sorry.
He says he wants UI that looks good but doesn't get in the way, and he wants it to be pretty fast. But the important thing is what he wants to be able to do is web browsing. That works pretty well. Email with PGP signing and encryption. Basically, everybody in FreeBSD does that. Coding. Sure. He says he's a hobbyist programmer and requires support for Lisp, Scheme, and Racket, Rust, and Python. And maybe even, he mentions Forth.
Forth. I know. What the heck?
Hey, Leo, come help me work on the boot menu.
We have our new bootloader program.
He wants to be able to do writing because obviously he runs blogs and podcasts and so on, so he does a lot of writing. He wants a password vault. He says he currently uses LastPass, and I use that on FreeBSD and it works very well. Although he's looking at maybe some kind of free open source replacement for LastPass. So if you have ideas for that, let him know. And he wants to do some light photo editing. He says he loves Photoshop and Lightroom, but he's pretty sure he can get away with GIMP and Darktable for the amount of editing he actually does.
Sure.
He even pulls out that, really old rant from Matthew Fuller about BSD versus Linux, as for some of the other reasons and so on. He mentions, specifically, he talks about a little bit about why he chose FreeBSD over, say, OpenBSD, NetBSD, or even PCBSD. And it's really, going for the larger community and the handbook and so on. Although PCBSD has a version of the handbook with even more stuff in it, right?
Sure.
But, and we're glad to see him land on FreeBSD. He says he does have a contingency plan. He's not throwing away his Windows computer or his Mac or his Linux machine, but his main workstation is going to be this FreeBSD machine.
Nice.
So he bought a nice workstation here. It's a Supermicro X11 based motherboard with a Xeon E3 1275 V5. That's the latest Skylake E5, E3. I have a server with one of these. It's really, really nice and super fast. The base clock is 3.6 gigahertz, and it's got 4 actual cores plus hyperthreading, and all the latest Skylake everything, DDR4 RAM, etc. It's got 32 gigs of ECC, a 512 gig NVMe M2 for his OS drive, which will be ZFS, nice. And then 4 1 terabyte Samsung SSDs that will be his storage pool. So that'll be really fast. 4 1 terabyte SSDs.
Oh, yeah.
Samsung Evo 850s.
You almost don't even need the NVMe at that point.
Right, yeah, exactly. Plus a DVD burner, because he actually bought his set of FreeBSD DVDs, which is nice. And then an NVIDIA GTX 960. That's actually the card I have. And that obviously works very well under FreeBSD as well. This is, although it's not really for gaming, because, he's got his Xbox and his PS4. Your PS4 runs FreeBSD too.
That's true. So.
And it says...
so this is his second FreeBSD box.
Yeah. And then, the third, because he's got the Mac, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he's got a 450 megabit wireless and dual band PCIe adapter with 3 antennas. He says, yes, sad to say, unless I rewire my house, I will have to use Wi-Fi on this beast. So I'll probably rewire my house.
Right.
Well, yes, if it's going to be your storage server and you're going to have 4 SSDs in a ZFS pool, you're going to need some fast wired networking. You're going to want
serving that over Wi-Fi just makes no sense.
Yeah, get some 10 gigabit going. You'll be much happier.
This is the boat anchor I attached to my Porsche.
Yeah, exactly. He says he also ordered a small NUC style box that he's going to look at doing his little self-hosted cloud with it. But yeah, so I found that pretty interesting. And I'll continue to chronicle my journey into the land of free open source software here once the Beast arrives, which is what he's named his FreeBSD box. But he says, in the meantime, excuse me, I have some reading to go do.
Now, I want to talk about a trend that's developed throughout the show over the year. And as a viewer of BSD Now, it's been one of the topics I have followed with a lot of fascination, and then got the real lowdown at Meet BSD, which felt like the true unveiling. But before we get to the true unveiling of TrueOS, let's talk about DigitalOcean, the first sponsor of the BSD Now program. Use the promo code FreeBSD Now, all one word. After you sign up, you apply it to your account, and you get a $10 credit. Now, they have droplets that run all versions of Linux, but also FreeBSD. And they have block storage, which you can attach and play around with ZFS. And they make it super simple to manage all of it with a very straightforward API and a fantastic interface. All SSDs, which means that your storage performance is always top-notch. 40 gigabit E connections to the hypervisors. They have team accounts if you want to work with other people, and they make it easy to transfer machine later on. The private networking is great for backups or if you want to do a front-end proxy. And the highly available storage means that if you want to add just a gigabyte or all the way up to 16 terabytes of SSD-backed storage, you can do it. But what I think is really kind of awesome for those of us that want to poke around with an open source project or experiment with something, 3 cents an hour is an unbelievable price to pay to get 2 gigs of RAM, a 2-core processor, 40 gigabyte SSD, and 3 terabytes of transfer. That's just remarkable. And if you use the promo code FreeBSD Now, all one word, you get a $10 credit. And you can try it out. 2 months for free if you do the $5 rig. DigitalOcean.com, and a big thank you to DigitalOcean for sponsoring the BSD Now show. Now, I am an inspiring ham. That means I haven't tried it yet, but I love the idea of eventually getting into it. And that was what got my attention for episode 158. But what made me stick around was learning about TrueOS.
If you've been watching the show for the past few months, you've probably heard me dropping little hints about the upcoming rename of PCBSD and TrueOS. And, we're taking our time announcing that, but we've pretty much made that more official now. We're asking folks to test out the software before a wider announcement this fall. So we consider this like a soft launch. So we have a link to the blog post where we talked about this, but I'll just kind of recap some of it here for you. So for those who've been wondering about the name change, it's actually been something we've discussed over the past few years. I think even going back 5 years ago, it had come up at one point, and we've discussed it. But with us beginning to move more aggressively with changes for 11.0 and eventually what became 12 current, the time just kind of seemed right, since we had just kind of changed everything. And not only that, we've changed software development release model if we're going to do a rebrand, this was the time to do it. So we have gone ahead and done that now. But discussing more about this in detail, I'm going to be giving a talk at Meet BSD 2016. So if you're going to be out there in person, you'll get to see it. Although I hope that gets recorded as well for those who can't attend. But here's some of the highlights we're going to be going over. So first of all, one of the differences with TrueOS versus PCBSD is we're no longer tied to specific FreeBSD point releases. So in the past, PCBSD 10.3 would come out, say, the same day or within a day or two of FreeBSD 10.3, and that's what it was based off of. So TrueOS instead is taking a little bit different path and is going to follow the rolling release model based upon FreeBSD current. So if you grab it right now, don't be shocked when you see it says 12.0-current in your uname. No, that's not a mistake. That is correct. And part of the reason for doing that was when we were doing the 11.0 release cycle about 3-4 months ago, we just ran into things where it's like I bought a brand new Carbon from Lenovo and the Wi-Fi wasn't supported. That was in current and wasn't going to make it into 11.0. So already it's like, we haven't even released yet, and I'm already like, oh, I wish I had support for this hardware, and we wanted to get away from that.
Well, in particular, when the support is already committed and you just can't have it, it's like,
you just can't have it yet, right? It's like, okay, well, you can wait 6 months, or depending on what type of support it is, you can wait 2-3 years if it's going to be in a .0, like if it's not going to get backported to stable. So I was just like, you know what? I'm sick of that. I want the FreeBSD, or I guess the TrueOS experience to be different, where it's like I just bought this hardware, the support landed. 2 weeks ago, great, I can have it now. Like I don't have to wait to get my Wi-Fi going. So that was the big motivation behind wanting to move to a rolling release model. So at the moment, that currently looks like about every 2 weeks we're pushing out a new release, which includes a new FreeBSD world kernel and packages to go with it, which has been working out pretty well. We've been doing it internally for about 3 months now and have written a bunch of special tooling to handle that. And of course, features such as boot environments finally make this a feasible option. In the early days of PCBSD, this is something I wouldn't have dreamed of, right? We didn't even have package at the time. We didn't have ZFS. We didn't have boot environments. So something like that would have been very risky to do. Nowadays, not a big deal. If the update fails, you roll back your boot environment, you send a bug report. We even have a self-updating updater now, so during the debugging of that, I can put a new update manager out, and you can just continue to update as you normally would once the bug has been resolved. So it's not even as difficult to fix update problems as it used to be. So all things considered, I'm really enjoying the rolling release model, and it's been nice to have like all my systems in sync and constantly updated. In addition to some of those changes, though, TrueOS does things differently than vanilla FreeBSD as well. We've started pulling in a lot of things from different places. So specifically, though, we've pulled in Matt Macy's DRM work and the Linux compat work because obviously we're a workstation and we want graphics to work. Turns out X and drivers are important to us. So we're pulling that stuff in, which hasn't even landed all in FreeBSD head yet. Other stuff we've pulled in is Bernard Spill, who we've interviewed here before as well, has imported LibreSSL directly in a base. So if you do install TrueOS and do package info, you won't see LibreSSL, but if you run OpenSSL-version, you'll see it's LibreSSL 242, I believe, is what it's running right now. So the latest stuff, and it's just directly in base. And another thing we're working on for this next week's release is we're switching to building from an external toolchain. So Clang's not even in the base system anymore. We now build from the Clang from port, which is LLVM 3.8 at the moment, and that fixes some things like OpenMP support being enabled for packages that build with it, etc. So again, we're doing a little bit of things differently. It's still FreeBSD though, and no, we're not forking or anything like that because this is all stuff we hope eventually will land in FreeBSD in some form or another. I don't anticipate them switching to LibreSSL in the base, but hopefully Bernard's options will be there, so at least the support's there for it, and we just happen to build with those flags on versus vanilla FreeBSD not. So that's kind of where we're at with it. Of course, there's a whole bunch of tooling that's been placed. We're in the process of replacing the legacy control panel with the new SysADM stuff, which I've talked about in the past, which is another Qt GUI that lets you do remote driving around of your TrueOS desktop or server with either WebSockets or REST APIs as well. So again, just a lot of stuff has changed, and I'm going to be talking about more of these things as the next couple months unfold here, and of course when I kind of give the official presentation at Meet BSD. But for the moment, we are asking people to go ahead and feel free to test it. Let us have feedback while we're we're working and fixing bugs and testing, getting us towards a more stable release. Like I think this last week we found an issue where sometimes one package repo updated and the other didn't, and that screwed up the updater. So I fixed that last night. Like little things like that still need to be sorted out, but it's getting pretty good. And again, we're running a whole office on it here at this point. We have been now for about 2-3 months. So it seems to be working out. And of course, we welcome your feedback, and take a look at the website. We have a Gitter channel if you want to chat with us. That's a Slack-like thing if you're not an IRC fan, and also Reddit. We officially support that as well. So get in touch with us on those various social media avenues.
So the chat room asks for more explanation on changing the name.
Oh, on changing the name. Okay, so PCBSD. It's a really long acronym, right? And we've also been using the name TrueOS for a while. So if you've installed PCBSD anytime in the last 5 years, you've seen on the selection screen, it'll say PCBSD Desktop or TrueOS Server, right? So we've already kind of been using both. But we wanted to unify on one. But unfortunately, PCBSD is a terrible name for a server.
Well, especially technically your name is PC-BSD, right?
Yes. Yes. And it's also a recognition of it's a different world today. I'm envisioning a day when we have ARM versions of TrueOS, right? And PCBSD doesn't really say ARM to me, or doesn't scream ARM, right?
There's definitely that.
There's definitely that. So again, the TrueOS name allows us to do things in a more generic way, where we could have a TrueOS embedded or a TrueOS ARM or server or workstation or various TrueOS targeted things that, again, PCBSD maybe doesn't really scream that. Plus, it's a mouthful. Yeah, how many people, I've been to so many trade shows, they're like, what does that even mean? Maybe they've not even heard of the words BSD. That's an acronym in and of itself. And then you throw PC on that, and it's just this mess of letters. And I know for years, even my folks couldn't remember what it was called. So it was time for something. TrueOS is easy to remember.
And then, when you compare it, there's like PC Linux OS. I'm like, well, that's a kind of a lame name, isn't it? And then you realize PCBSD basically means the same thing, right?
It's exactly the same thing, right? So, and I know some people were kind of a little concerned that we dropped BSD out of the name. And so, no, it has nothing to do with hating on BSD or anything. It's just a reflection of we wanted something that's a little less.
In particular, it's the type of people that need to be able to remember the name don't know what BSD is. And so sticking 3 random letters in there doesn't help them.
It doesn't really help them in any case. But if they go, now true operator, okay, I can remember that. Yes. That makes sense. And it was the least radical name change we could have made, since, again, we already owned all the TrueOS stuff and we're using it.
Because it's not the name I recommended after we had our discussion with Alfred, where he complained about the name PCBSD, and then like a week later you started this whole rename to TrueOS thing.
Yep. Well, we kicked around a bunch of names internally. We had some good ones, but at the end we were like, we kind of like TrueOS, and it already has been in use and stuff. So
where did mine come on the ranking there?
Yours was second. But so the TrueOS thing also works because, again, we're all IX people who work on this for the most part. But a lot of us are, and we have TrueNAS and FreeNAS. So it kind of fit in with that whole family of naming. So I was like, okay, I like that. Like I'm cool with that. But again, it's all open source. It's still BSD licensed. So nothing has changed as far as that goes. We're all still on GitHub, and hopefully it'll get better than ever is what we're looking at, because it already seems to be. I'm already doing far more stuff on TrueOS than I ever did on
I really
BSD.
liked I put it on both of my laptops right before a conference, which is kind of a risky thing to do. Although it was slightly easier now because I could install to my existing zpool. So I basically installed TrueOS 12 in a new boot environment on my old PCBSD 10 that had been hacked and cobbled to actually be FreeBSD 11. And had other terrible things done to it. So just a fresh boot environment, and it was all clean.
And you can do a B and min mount and then go grab your changes. Yep. Like, for example, I had my OpenVPN config on an old boot environment. So I just mounted, grabbed it. Okay, I'm done. And then once you've moved stuff over, you can nuke that old boot environment when you're comfortable. So that's the upgrade path for those wondering who are still on PCBSD and want to switch. You'll install into a boot environment, cherry pick the files out you want from your old boot environments, and then you're good to go. So it just works. And speaking of, I put that feature into FreeNAS not too long ago too, just this last week. So FreeNAS will allow you to do that here soon too, so you don't have to blow away your boot pool. But anyway, that's for another day. Anyway, I'm not going to mention all the other names we consider, because it'll make you guys start arguing about, you should have picked this or that.
Yeah, we should not do that.
TrueOS, deal with it. We've already registered the name and set up the site, done everything.
Yes, you already built a new website and got the logo and.
That's right. That's right. So, anyway, but yeah, we'll talk more about that in the future. And of course, when I give the talk at BSD, talking about some of the details and whatnot, you'll get to hear more about what the plan is going forward. And I think that's when we'll do like the hard launch and do a press release and all that. And hopefully at that point, it's solid enough where I feel like telling people, okay, now it's time to migrate from PCBSD. Everybody
already did.
See, there you go. I know a lot of us already have, but for mere mortals, Alan, I must admit you're slightly above what people would consider a mere mortal computer user. But for everyone else who doesn't want all the bugs or whatever, give us a couple months and then we'll go ahead and tell you.
I haven't upgraded the machines of the other people at my office yet.
Okay,
but eventually we'll have to do that.
You'll have to do that. We've done a lot of work too to make 4K a thing too. Like 4K work really well.
All the machines in our office are dual monitor 1080p.
Okay. Well, then you won't care so much. But in PCDM now, you can even choose the DPI. Mm-hmm. So if you have a 3K or 4K, like my Carbon is 3K, then I can set a DPI for that, and then that sets it for your desktop when you log in, which is kind of cool.
So you can take your 3K screen and make it look like my 1080p screen?
Correct.
Just slightly smoother edges.
The smoother edges makes things bigger so you can read them. Yep. You don't have this teeny tiny little font. So we're just doing a lot of work to make those things just work. Mm-hmm. And I've been very pleased with the results.
Every time we talk about ZFS or ZFS, as Mr. Jude puts it, don't you honestly think, what's the best way to set things up? Well, Josh gave us his best do's and don'ts of setting up ZFS.
Okay, we're joined now by Josh Petzel. First of all, you've been on the show before, but thank you so much for coming back.
Sure thing. Nice to be on again.
So I guess your title now at IX, titles tend to change there, and who knows what it is every week. But I guess at the moment it's storage architect. So we're glad to talk to the architect today, and we got lots of stuff to talk about related to storage and ZFS.
I try not to use my Matrix voice.
Right. Well, it's too bad. If we didn't get you a few weeks ago, we could have had the Santa hat and beard back, maybe.
I dug it up out of storage. I was almost going to wear it today, and then I was like, nah.
Yeah, just a couple weeks too late. Oh, well.
Yes.
All right, so you got the next one,
Alan? We've heard that you've moved away from the Bay Area, and you're now in a new location. How's it treating you?
It's not too bad. This is home. So my wife grew up in very northern Wisconsin up on Lake Superior, and I grew up in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. So we're halfway in between those. We're in a pretty remote location, northern Wisconsin, but this is really our people. So we fit in pretty good here.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, Alan was pointing out to me, you're actually farther north than he is. I had to look at a map and go, no way, I guess he is.
Yeah, how's that?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do about living here is troll the Canadians about how I'm going south to BSD Can this year and stuff. No, we're in Canada. You're in the U.S. It's like, nah. I'm in one of those parts of the U.S. that's north of some of the parts in Canada.
So I live in the good part of Canada, but that's further south.
Yeah. Right.
So how's the internet connectivity up there? How's that work?
Well, I have far better internet here at my house than I had living in Silicon Valley.
Oh,
so it turns out that the internet infrastructure here is relatively new, and there's only one way to bring internet to people who live widely scattered over large areas, and that's via fiber. Mm-hmm. So you'll be happy to know that I have a shiny fiber connection running right to the house.
Oh, I hate you.
More than happy to set that up as fast as you want. They're like, how much do you want to pay for it? You want a giggy fiber connection? No problem. I live quite modestly with a 10 megabit connection. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty slow by modern standards, but it's also like $7 a month or some crazy thing like that too. So,
well, really,
it's
all about the reliability, right?
Yeah, so far as I know, there hasn't been an outage. So I've been living here since July, and as far as I know, it's never been down. But
you guys are killing me, both of you with fiber on your house. That's it. I'm moving up to where you live, Josh. I mean, gosh, hook me up. All right, well, let's get into the meat of this here. So I know you've done a lot of support and stuff with ZFS over the years. So tell us what's the most interesting ZFS bug you've maybe come across so far.
Well, I was thinking about that. The most interesting bug that I've ever come across is we moved from ZFS version 28 to feature flag stuff. at the same time that we moved from Samba 3 to Samba 4. And Samba 4 has native support for ACLs, and Samba 3 sort of faked it and used Unix permissions behind the scenes. And it turned out that if you did not upgrade your Z pool and use the feature flag 5000 kernel modules with Samba 4.1 with a pool created on version 28, you could corrupt your pool.
Really?
And blow away the space map and end up with kernel panics when you tried to import the pool read-write. And so we, you had to import the pool read-only and copy the data off and then scrag it and rebuild it, because of course there's no tools for dealing with a ZFS pool with a bad space map. So that's probably the most interesting bug.
How long did it take you guys to figure that out?
Yeah, a little while.
Right.
And the best part about that bug is send and receive snapshot replication would happily send the corruption over to the remote system as well. So we actually lost some primary pools and some backup pools to that, where the primary pool would go corrupted and then, the backup pool is corrupted as well.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a little less than pleasant. So,
But
Man.
that's probably the most interesting one.
but the pool wouldn't import, but the data was still there.
Yeah, you could import it read-only,
Right.
because then you don't care about the space map. And so that's what we ended up doing. In fact, it ended up we ended up doing a Memorial Day recovery run down to LA, where I loaded my truck up with pallets of 4 terabyte hard drives and shelves, and ended up driving them down from Silicon Valley to LA, and over the long weekend recovered a system that had that problem. So,
Oh, man. I guess you don't have to do too many of those up in Wisconsin now.
no. But there's a joke about never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon filled with magnetic tape, and never underestimate the storage capacity of a full-size SUV filled with 4 terabyte hard drives either. So,
Oh, man.
Yeah, I think Google still does that experiment every once in a while and finds that it's faster to ship hard drives FedEx than it is to try to use the internet, no matter how fast your internet is.
Yeah, we had about 300 terabytes in the back of the truck, so
Nice.
Tracy was pretty happy with that.
Oh, I bet.
Although now I can fit that in like 8 U's. So how difficult is it to actually support ZFS in production, especially compared to other file systems?
Yeah, so there's a few things that are frustratingly game over situations with ZFS that you wish weren't. For instance, if you add VDEVs that you're not particularly happy about adding, you can paint yourself into a corner there. Now, there's talk about there being detachable VDEVs someday.
There's code for that actually works, but it doesn't work with RAID Z, only with mirrors and stripes. But that does solve the problem of when you're trying to add a S-log or something and you accidentally add it as a single disk stripe.
Yeah.
So that's
unfortunate.
That is or will be undoable, but not in a way that it will still leave it there as a reminder. So any data that got written to it will be remapped to a different drive, but it will stay there as a virtual VDEV that just can't store anything to taunt you about your mistake forever.
Mocking me silently for years to come.
But yeah, I almost feel like
Side you go, forever won't dominate your destiny, right?
it almost seems like.
Anyways, so that's frustrating. That can be somewhat frustrating, and that's caused some problems in the past. It makes it frustrating to deal with, because a lot of times in a production environment, backing up all the data, destroying the pool, and recreating the pool is not a particularly attractive option.
Because it'll take like a week.
So, there can be that. Even in some environments where you have the additional storage to do it, simply migrating the data, you can do sends and receives on the back end, but eventually you have to flip the switch. And so that means taking services down. And when the service is, iSCSI and 300 VMs, it is just a lot of times not a convenient time to do that,
Sure.
So that can make things challenging. Another thing that can make things challenging is the aforementioned ZFS space map. Corruption in there, problems in there. There's no check disk, there's no FSIC, there's no anything. I mean, space map corruption is game over. You can import the pool read only, you can copy the data off, and that's certainly a much better scenario for a lot of people than the alternatives. However, it would still be nice to be able to repair those pools. And it's just not an option, having the option. Right?
Is that just that
you might argue that a 400 terabyte pool might take 3 weeks to do that too, but at least having the option to do it is better than having no alternative.
Yeah, because
is there a technical reason why that doesn't exist, or is just nobody's written the tool to do it yet?
I think it's nobody's written the tool simply because it doesn't scale very well, and so you very quickly run into these it takes 3 weeks. Kind of a thing to do. So, and people go, well, nobody would want to do that.
In ZDB, there's
and they're probably
right. In ZDB, there's one that can scan the space map and try to find lost space, but not actually fix it.
But not fix it. Yeah. So what you'd want to do is rebuild your space map from the blocks that are in use on the pool. Scan the whole pool for blocks that are in use and use those to build a new space map. And that tool doesn't exist.
And would have the extra complication of more space will probably be allocated in the meantime.
Right, exactly. Right. You'd need space for that space map, right? And you certainly wouldn't be able to write to the pool while you were doing it. So some other things that make ZFS a little challenging, people always knew that long RAID Z groups would take a long time to resilver. And that they would take a long time to scrub, especially as they filled up. But I think it took, some of these pools were large enough that it took a couple years to get enough data on them to really reap the full measure of the consequences of that decision. And so, people were deploying these pools with 30 10 drive RAID Z2 VDEVs. This is awesome and this is great. And look, I have 400 terabytes of storage and they're amazingly resilient. And then they get to be 70 or 80% full and they have a drive fail. And oh my goodness, it took 3 weeks to resilver the drive, or it took 2 weeks to resilver, or it took 9 days to resilver or something. So some of those things are starting to come to light. And those were not immediately obvious properties of ZFS. So the other thing that isn't immediately obvious is those resilver times are totally dependent on file size as well. So, if you have a pool with 4 billion 4K files on it, resilvering a drive in there is a lot different than having 100 1 terabyte files. And that wasn't immediately obvious either. So I think some of those things are starting to come to light. And that does get a bit frustrating because in those very large pools, if you have a single degraded drive and a VDEV, you have additional redundancy. However, it's not the sort of thing that you want a 3-year-old array cranking away at maximum I/O for 9 days. It just doesn't make anybody feel good.
Right.
And the consequence is, 400 terabytes might just go away here if this goes sideways. So that makes things a little challenging. Certainly the benefits of the RAID Z resilver when the array is empty is really cool. You can do a drive replacement in seconds on an empty array, minutes on a lightly used array, but as they get full, the tables quickly turn to favor the hardware RAID controllers.
Yeah, so I know specifically because of that, in the case of mirrors, there's actually talk of an optional sequential resilver instead of actually walking the metadata and doing the smart resilver, because once it's more than about half full, it actually takes longer to do it the smart way. But again, I don't know that that's possible with RAID Z because you don't actually know where the blocks start and end without crawling through the data.
Right.
And then, but yeah, it seems like maybe the ZFS add command should require you to use like the force flag if you want to add a single striped VDEV to a pool that has any VDEVs that aren't all stripes, just to maybe prevent some of that foot shooting.
Yep. Yeah. The ZFS add command definitely warns if redundancy levels are different these days. So there is some warning for that, and it has that -n flag so that you can always see what you're doing. So
It just
that
requires
helps.
people
Of course,
to know to do that. and no one remembers
you have to
until
do
they've
that.
shot their own foot off once.
And and the other problem with FreeBSD is, your tendency is to want to use virtualized device names, and so to avoid device name hopping around and making you sad. And so a lot of times when you're adding devices to pools, you're dealing with GPT IDs or some other type of label, and so you might not even immediately realize that you skipped a line reading glabel list, and that's not really the hard drive, that's an SSD, or it isn't always immediately obvious that you're doing something that you don't want to do. So I get very, very paranoid when I'm running zpool add. I use the N flag about 3 times, and am I sure I want to do this? Am I absolutely sure? Am I really, really sure? And of course, FreeNAS and TrueNAS, we've wrapped all that stuff in a GUI, and it's ostensibly user doable, and you always kind of like, hey, we're going to be expanding our pool this weekend. It's like, can we help with that, please? Because that is something you really don't. Well, it's going to be Saturday night. It's like, yeah, I would much rather hop on a call with you on Saturday night than
Have you do this wrong?
deal with the ramifications of
Yeah.
these going sideways.
Yeah. The desperate Sunday morning. Oh my gosh, what did I do?
Yeah. So it makes me, expanding storage, it's always sort of a miracle to me when you expand storage and it doesn't, it's always my nightmare, that you go to expand storage and all of a sudden everything vanishes.
Sure.
And you're like, what just happened here? Fortunately, I've never seen that happen with ZFS, and I'm fairly confident, but, when you're dealing with large amounts of data, it's, use 500, 700 terabyte, 1 petabyte pools, and it's just, it'd really be inconvenient if they went away.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
doubt.
we have a backup, but it would take a month to restore.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff is, nobody would be very happy about that. So,
So over the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot, of course, about IX, who's a sponsor here, but they've built some pretty darn wild systems that we've shown pictures of and kind of make all the watchers and listeners drool over. So do you have a favorite out of any of the crazy stuff that got built down there?
We've got some pretty big systems. Some of them bigger than others. There is some eight shelf units out there with 4 terabyte drives in them, and those would be the old shelves. So they're 45 drives per shelf.
Oh wow.
A lot of those units were not necessarily optimized for size, but were optimized for spindles for running VMware. So they aren't even as large as they could be, because mostly they're running VMs and things like that aren't necessarily space intensive, but are IOPS intensive. Our standard hardware platform is a dual E5 2600 of some sort, and going up to 512 gigs of RAM. So I think some of the stuff, when you start to think about a dual E5 system with 512 gigs of RAM as being mundane, then you know you're broken by hardware, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, we have some stuff in the labs that is a lot more fun than that. And at one point, we built a system with a ridiculous number of disks, and we had 4 terabyte drives in it, and it ended up being shy of a petabyte of storage, so we called it the Terafiler, and that was pretty cool. And then we upgraded the drives to 6 terabytes, and we shied away from the obvious name change, and people marketing, I guess, thought that wouldn't go over well. So, and then on the systems that aren't as big but yet still impressive, we have some all SSD rigs running ZFS, and ZFS isn't necessarily optimized for SSDs. Its write path is pretty expensive. And so the performance of ZFS, in an all-out performance war, is never going to match things that do less work. if you look at XFS or ext4 or anything like that, they just don't do as much work writing, and they're always going to have a performance advantage. But there still are people who want the benefits of ZFS and the performance of SSDs behind it. And so we have several all SSD rigs that we've built. They have 20 or 30 SSDs in them, and they can get fairly crushing performance as well, even though in terms of size, they're not typically very large. You say, well, this is 10 terabytes or 12 terabytes. Price-wise, it's interesting. I was just talking to Warner Losh yesterday about the fact that the Fusion IO Octal cost more than my first house. And that was a big, all-flash storage subsystem in its day. And nowadays, we routinely build things that are twice as fast as an Octal. And while they certainly, aren't cheap, they sometimes aren't as expensive as my car. So
that's I think you're saying, every couple of years we add a 0 to the performance and take a 0 off the price.
Yeah, isn't that the truth?
Right.
Yeah.
So most of the problems that you see are probably user created, or are more of them the fault of the OS or the management tools or ZFS itself?
I see all sorts of problems. Certainly having a copy on write file system available to users is a new paradigm for a lot of people. And so ZFS put, enterprise storage in the hands of people who had never had to deal with enterprise storage. And so you certainly see a lot of problems caused, by the fact that, hey, you have snapshots in existence, which means you really can't delete things. And people just, that's a paradigm that people don't understand. So a lot of full pools, a lot of, hey, I just deleted 4 terabytes and nothing happened.
And I ended up with less space than I had before because of the free list.
So you see a lot of that. You see also a lot of non-intuitive problems that were caused by ZFS itself. And certainly ZFS has, taken a lot of those problems to heart and improved itself. Or the developers have improved it to ZFS. So for instance, before ZFS had asynchronous delete, a common paradigm was, well, I put 3 billion files on my NFS server, and now I deleted the data set, and everything went out to lunch.
For a week.
So the system went unresponsive, so I then decided to reboot it. And now it's just stuck, well, with all the lights blinking, and it's not fully booted up, And you had to wait for the delete to happen before it would import the pool.
Yeah.
Right? And so we did a lot of, finding the TXG group before the delete and rolling back the pool to that, and then saying, yeah, you probably can't ever delete that. So having things like asynchronous delete, really improved the world for ZFS. So I would say that they've been addressing the problems. Adding VDEVs that are the wrong redundancy level, that certainly is a ZFS problem as far as I'm concerned. That ZFS causes.
That one I think is sometimes even just confusion between the difference of ZFS add and ZFS attach sound similar, and they do very different things.
Yes. Yes, that can happen. Or just forgetting to add the word log, Doing zpool add and you forget to type log, and all of a sudden you have another VDEV.
I saw someone, that happened to someone this week, and I'm like, well, and they're like, but we were planning to add another mirror to our set. I'm like, okay, so what you do is add the other drive to that, and then swap out the SSD and then now you have the new mirror, and then you can add the log properly. So you maybe just saved yourself from shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, so I think like most things, users are the source of most of the problems, but ZFS certainly, ZFS has been around for a decade now. Well, it's been around, if you talk to the ZFS developers, of course, it's been around longer than that.
It's been open source for a decade.
It's been around in the hands of people for a decade, and it's still a young, immature file system. I don't think we found all of the bugs in ZFS that, might not necessarily be a bug. Hey, it's behaving as designed. It takes 3 weeks to resilver, but it's sort of, that's not really very enterprise usable. I think we probably haven't found all those edge cases, but as we found some, I would say async delete was a huge one. That what caused a lot of very real problems, not having that. And certainly since that's hit, it's solved a lot of problems. Bookmark support was another big one that sort of shored up a glaring hole in ZFS. When you're using snapshots for replication, if you accidentally, if your retention time is shorter than the time it takes you to replicate them, you can have all sorts of problems.
And have to start over.
You're deleting snapshots that you actually need, and bookmarks sort of solve that problem, by letting you delete things that haven't been replicated yet and still be able to not break your replication.
Yeah, that one bit us with the PCBSD package CDN system, as if one machine got too far behind and missed the window of when enough snapshots existed, it basically had to start replication from scratch and resend 500 gigabytes over the internet.
Yeah, that can be very challenging.
No fun.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, so one thing that happened a few months back, we read the article on IX Systems site where you did the blog post talking about being careful using ZFS in a VM, and there was some big scary language in there. And we had a whole bunch of comments and emails, and we still occasionally get those, Alan, where people are like, what is that? What did that mean? So can you elaborate a little bit exactly on what that blog was talking about and what to do or not to do, I guess, when running ZFS in a VM?
Sure. So the first thing to point out is VMware is the single most popular platform for running FreeNAS there is. FreeNAS systems phone home and tell us what they're running on, and VMware is the most popular standalone platform by like heads and shoulders. So lots of people virtualize FreeNAS, and of course FreeNAS is ZFS under the hood. So that's the only file system they're running. So the thing about virtualizing ZFS is you're abstracting the disks away from ZFS, which means it's no different than running it against a SAN LUN or running it against a RAID controller. ZFS no longer has direct control of the hardware. And so you just need to ensure that the things that are being done to those devices is not something that ZFS will get upset about. So for instance, if you're virtualizing ZFS and the backend LUNs have a RAID controller, you need to turn the write cache off on the RAID controller. You need to make sure that any scrubs that are being done by the RAID controller itself are not overlapping with scrubs being done by ZFS. So you have to take some additional steps, and the consequences of not taking those additional steps are they can stomp on each other and cause pool corruption. So, and I've seen pool corruption in the form of the pool won't import anymore, or it'll corrupt the space map, and you can't import read-write anymore. So we've always recommended that virtualizing ZFS is okay, as is running it on a RAID controller, as is running it on SAN. Lots of people do that. For instance, Delphix, that's what they do. There's ZFS on top of a SAN, right? It's clearly safe to do. However, it involves making sure that you've turned off the write cache on the RAID controller for those LUNs, or that you've disabled the parity check jobs on the RAID controller, or that you make sure they're scheduled at a different time than the ZFS scrubs. And so if you do those things, then virtualizing ZFS is perfectly safe. Running a system that has ZFS in a VM, pretty safe. In fact, we do it all the time. The vast majority of FreeNAS and TrueNAS development is done in VMs. We don't store data there, long term. But for instance, the IX Systems mail server is a VM and it's running ZFS, so it can be done safely. You just have to be a little careful about it. So.
Some extra precautions to take, things to plan out ahead of time before you just nilly-willy deploy it and find out the hard way, right?
And I'd much rather scare people with, you shouldn't do this. It's a bad idea to do this. Don't do this. And have them find out some more information about it and say, okay, I'm doing this safely. Than to say, yeah, it'll be fine, when there's some, every RAID controller made has the write cache enabled.
Right, because that's what makes it
fast. Which is, a bad deal when you're sticking ZFS on a VM underneath it.
Right. So you don't want somebody that doesn't understand all the facets of it to be like, oh, I'm going to run, this on top of in a VM on top of a RAID controller because Josh said it was okay. It's like, no.
Right.
Josh said don't do it unless you're very sure you know what you're doing and you've ticked all these boxes and made sure you've actually got it set up correctly.
Exactly. So
So to get a more experienced field ops perspective, what do you think about ZFS with versus without ECC memory? And is it any more dangerous than running something other than ZFS?
well, the answer, as always, is it's
Right.
complicated, and this is a very touchy political situation because some people who have a lot of experience and knowledge about ZFS have weighed in one way or the other. I'm pretty sure Matt Aarons has said there's no need for ZFS to have
Well,
ECC.
his quote was more,
So-
you always want ECC, but if you can't have it, you're still better off with ZFS than using ext4.
Yeah. There we go. All right. So let's talk about that for a second. So if you have ECC RAM and something goes haywire, your system will either stop or ECC will fix the problem. Right? If you don't have ECC RAM, your system will happily go lucky scribbling on disks, whatever it tells it to do. The problem comes in with ZFS is, once again, there's no way to fix things like broken space maps. And so if you have non-ECC RAM and it's been happily scribbling on your pool and it happens to scribble on your space map, that's a game over thing. So your pool is gone. If you have non-ECC RAM and ext4 or XFS or anything like that, and it scribbles on your storage device, you run fsic and it repairs the storage. Sure, you might have some files that are scragged, because fsic isn't going to make corrupted files go away. But at the end of the day, it will happily move that stuff into lost and found, and you'll be able to mount up your file system. So, in theory, while the advantages of ZFS are nice to have, it is a bit dangerous to run non-ECC RAM and have hardware failures with ZFS, simply because there are a lot of scenarios in ZFS that are game over. So we don't ever build anything that's non-ECC. And I have to admit that I have very limited experience running non-ECC RAM on ZFS. So I had some systems at home for several years that had non-ECC RAM, and other than that, it's just not something we choose to
Don't want to chance it.
deal with. Yeah, and quite frankly, anytime you're dealing with a system with a large amount of RAM, ECC becomes necessary just from other
Right.
reasons.
Most motherboards won't support more than 32 gigs of RAM without ECC anyway.
Right. So I always recommend to people that they run ECC, and there's plenty of consumer stuff out there now that has the ability to run ECC.
Like the little Atom boards and.
Yep.
But yeah, I think in the end, other than obviously the space map is kind of a Achilles heel of ZFS still. But if something happens to the contents of a file, ZFS is more likely to be able to actually tell that happened and give you an error rather than the corrupted data. Whereas if you corrupt just a file, FSCK on ext4 isn't going to find that.
No.
And so,
I mean, bit rot is a real problem, on especially as disks get larger. So you can easily, for under $1,000 these days, be sitting on 24 or 30 terabytes of storage. And anytime you fill that up, the chances of bit flips and files being corrupted, and that's significant. If you run a pool that's 40 terabytes and don't scrub it for a year and run scrub, I can guarantee you your chances are good that you're going to find corrupted files that ZFS will either fix or flag as I can't fix this, depending on your redundancy level. So having ECC RAM, is a safeguard against hardware failure. Either the system will stop or it will fix the problem. But it all depends, once again, on how how important your data is. I have data at home. I could care less if I lost it. I mean, if I really need to, I can recreate it. I have other data that is irreplaceable. So the data I have that's irreplaceable, it goes to two systems at home. It goes to a backup system, and it goes up to the cloud. And certainly my systems at home have ECC RAM, but it wouldn't be a huge loss if I lost the pool on one of them.
Right, but in the end, the whole reason you're using ZFS is to protect you against hardware failures on the disks. So why wouldn't you also protect yourself from hardware failures in the RAM?
Right.
What about SSDs? Cool. Especially you were talking about all SSD pools. Because SSDs are doing a bunch of, was it like flash redirection layer or whatever, and there's moving blocks all over the place without telling you. Do you ever see unusual amounts of errors from SSDs?
I haven't, but SSDs have their own unique challenges with ZFS. For instance, when ZFS grew trim support, it was trying to trim 128K blocks, and that exposed problems in a lot of SSDs. So, for instance, you'd run into situations where you'd run zpool create and the system would just go out to lunch for hours, while the SSD was trying to digest this. Hey, it wants me to trim all of me,
but in small chunks, not all at once.
Yeah, that was a problem. We've had issues. I've had issues with SSDs that the firmware simply locks up. I've seen SSDs that you have trim on, and over a couple of weeks the firmware finally just hangs the whole SSD. I've seen particular models of that, and so for instance we've had to blacklist doing trim on certain SSDs or simply not use them for ZFS. So they definitely pose some challenges. Another challenge that SSDs provide that isn't really related to ZFS per se is they can handle much higher queue depths than spinning disks, and ZFS is tuned to not blow spinning disks up. So you can if you have an all SSD pool, you can turn the queue depth up and get far higher performance out of them than you would with the default ZFS tuning. However, ZFS doesn't allow that tuning per pool.
Yeah.
And so if you have a system that has an SSD pool and a spinning disk pool, you can be challenged to find a tuning that doesn't tank your spinning disk pool or your SSD pool, because of course the things the SSD pool wants will bring the spinning disk pool to its knees. Otherwise, if you tune for the spinning disk pool, you're really crippling the performance of the SSD pool.
Yeah, I think the default write queue depth limit is 10, and 10. If you set it much higher on a spinning disk, then it could take whole seconds to get a read request answered.
Yes,
because it gets at the back of this long line of things that have to happen.
Yeah, a 7200 RPM disk has an average latency of 7 milliseconds, which means it can do somewhere around 100 to 150 IOPS per, and if you set the queue depth to 32, you will definitely
feel that.
Definitely reap what you sow there.
Right, a little suffering.
Whereas a modestly expensive SSD can do 1,000 times that.
Right. Yeah.
So if you could just pick, say, one single best piece of advice for a sysadmin who's getting ready to deploy ZFS somewhere out in the field, what would it be?
That's a challenging one. I would say be familiar with the attributes of a copy on write file system. So if you've got experience with Waffle or with EMCs or something like that, transfer that experience and that knowledge to ZFS. If you don't have experience with a copy on write file system of any sort, do some reading. Because there are just attributes of copy on write file systems that aren't intuitive. And since ZFS is so different from log file systems or from journal-based file systems that we're all familiar with, you can run into some really non-intuitive behavior. So
Okay.
So if you could see any one feature of ZFS be implemented, what would it be?
Oh, that's easy. So I would really like to see whole pool replication between two pools. Block level, real time, whole pool replication.
So like continuous replication? Yeah.
Yes. Not
Right.
snapshot based, not async at all, but just you send this TXG group to this pool, you send it to that pool. The ability to keep two pools in sync on an IO by IO or TXG by TXG basis. So,
And
That's kind of cool. Is anybody working on that as far as you know?
I know somebody that would like to do it if they could convince their employer to pay them to do it.
yeah. I've done some precursory exploration, and I've always, I think it'd be a really cool feature to have, and certainly there are business cases for it. And working for a storage-based ZFS company, tried to poke and prod in the appropriate direction. As far as I know, nobody is actually actively working on this project at all. However, it has been discussed to some degree, and some how would we implement this types of things have been kicked around. What technologies could this apply to? Is there anything that's relevant? That sort of investigation has been done. So I somehow feel that perhaps, that could see the light of day. Would I work on it myself? I always like to joke that I'm the most dangerous type of C programmer. And the most dangerous type of C programmer is the one that can get their programs to compile. And that's right. So the ability to, the barrier to entry to programming C is pretty high, because if you can't even get the thing to compile, then at least you're safe. I'm unfortunately slightly more skilled than that. However, I'm not much more skilled than that. So I always joke that when I'm committing C code to anything, which I do from time to time, look out.
Right.
So probably it's not something I would work on myself in terms of writing the C code, but definitely developing the feature and helping to test it and coming up with use cases. And okay, that's not quite right. I would love to be involved with. So we'll see.
Well, there you go. If anybody's working on this or interested, you need to get in touch with Josh.
Yes, I
That'd be a
will
really cool feature.
make a connection between two people for that.
Cool. So you have any interesting war story? I guess the most difficult recovery, or anything you could think of that would be interesting to the audience here.
There's been a lot of things that I've done over the past several years. I think a lot of the really interesting problems were the culmination of a long period of research. For instance, when ZFS first debuted, it had very unpredictable write times, write latencies, and that made it challenging to use for block storage. And having that come together such that ZFS was an effective block storage, low latency type of deal, or predictable latency, there was a lot of time involved in that, and a lot of things had to happen. A lot of work was done, and that certainly didn't happen overnight. That was the culmination of a year's worth of effort. We've also done some pool recoveries where the aforementioned load a bunch of drives in the truck and take them down to LA. But I think a lot of the current problems are really just how ZFS interacts with things like Samba, things like NFS, and they're not very interesting war stories. I went into the lab with a bunch of NFS servers and came out with, here's how we need to do this, here's how we need to do that, tuning wise to get to a satisfying performance profile. So one of the challenging things with running ZFS on big NFS servers is, big, high, busy NFS servers on 10 gig E require quite a bit of memory for NFS and for just the kernel for doing 10 gig networking. And ZFS, of course, is always memory hungry. And so finding the right balance between enough memory to not hobble your 10 gig performance, versus not taking so much memory away from ZFS that you hobble its performance, and finding the right balance has been fairly satisfying, and hopefully we'll get some better auto tuning so that it doesn't require a maestro to turn all the dials and find the right thing. But some of those scenarios have been fairly satisfying.
But free RAM is wasted RAM, but any contention will just kill all your performance.
Yeah, and of course, ZFS contention for RAM typically means kernel panic, right? So, if the ARC can't get an allocation it thinks that it deserves, it deadlocks the system, or live locks, or kernel panics, or all sorts of bad, nasty, horrible behaviors. So, you tend to want to be very conservative. And then, you start to say, okay, I've got a system with 128 gigs of RAM. I'm being really conservative with the ARC, and I've set it to 70 gigs. Now I can turn up NFS memory arbitrarily high as I want, because certainly networking and NFS aren't going to need 30 gigs of RAM. And so then you turn it all up, and then you go, okay, we found the optimal value here. Now we need to increase your ARC size. Well, we'll have to reboot the system. Well, we'll find a window for that in March, because you can't dynamically increase ARC. Or you go the other way and you say, well, we don't want to have to reboot the system, so we're going to just set the ARC to 116 gigs. And then you're constantly in fear, okay, is this the NFS memory change I make that tips the system over and causes it to deadlock? So some of that stuff is a little bit challenging, finding the optimal values. And of course, networking memory requirements, NFS memory requirements, those are all so workload dependent that you can't come across any sort of useful defaults. We have customers that we've had to turn the file handle allocation off, right? Because otherwise, 30,000 people try and open 80,000 files, and suddenly NFS wants 900 gigs of memory. And, so we've just had to disable it, in order to provide them with a usable system. So it's all across the board. Other people, their idea of an NFS server is two systems are going to access this, and they want to run wide open, read or write performance. So you just can't come up with usable, global defaults that work for everyone. It does require some.
Well, yeah, tuning. I can see, a university where every student's home directory is on this NFS server, versus a thing where, we have 2 or 3 virtualization machines that are just going to read giant VM images off your NFS, right?
Right.
Do you think it would be possible to someday have the ARC limit be runtime tunable?
Yeah, in fact, I've talked about that quite a bit, and I think we understand how that would work. It would essentially be setting a high water mark instead of, you can't forcibly evict memory out of ARC, but you could lower the high water such that as things fell off the ARC, it wouldn't allocate new things. So you could do that fairly easily. And then increasing it, of course, would be pretty straightforward as well. So hopefully that will see the light of day someday too.
Yeah, the one I was having this morning, actually, and yesterday morning, was the daily find that goes through the system and tries to find the set UID binaries or whatever. Ever since I upgraded to the latest head 3 days ago, now it makes the other allocation in ARC go up to about 6 gigs out of my 16 gigs. So my ARC limit is set to 6 gigs out of 16, and so it's got 6 gigs of MFU and MRU, but then also 6 gigs of other, and then there's no RAM left for anything else.
Right.
And it was I don't know what made it start doing this just the other day.
Yeah, and of course the ZFS answer to that is, well, serves you right for trying to run it on a system with 16 gigs of RAM, right? Isn't that crazy that we think that that's a low amount of RAM?
Yeah, I remember when 512 was a lot. Oh. Now 512 with an extra 000 on the end is kind of a lot.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh well.
So what keeps you motivated to work on open source stuff like this?
I think, I was thinking about that a little bit. I've been involved with FreeBSD since the mid-90s. And that was really more of a pragmatic thing than anything else. When I started my involvement, my employer was trying to convert to open source, and so it was just easier to be involved in the community than it was to constantly try to have to maintain local patch sets and all of that fun stuff.
Mhm.
I think it's just sort of a couple of things. One, the reality is working on commercial code bases, they're all sort of ugly. And the more closed source and secretive they are, the uglier they are, because as when you're writing code, you're trying to solve the immediate problem. You're always under a time crunch. There's always resource constraints, and you can do some fairly hideous things.
And no
And
one
just
will ever
go,
see it.
well, I hope nobody ever sees this, because if they do, they will hate the person that wrote it and think they're an idiot. But they're not under my constraints. So here's the most horrible hack I've ever written.
Mhm.
But you can't open source those kinds of things, because there's always people who are going to look at that and go, dude,
What?
really?
Yeah.
Like, come on. And so open source really to me becomes sort of, you sludge through the day, and you're kind of sludging through a mud pit, and it's all dirty and hacky, and you're kind of going along. And certainly we try and do things the right way, but a lot of times there's other concerns other than the purity of engineering, right? But
Mhm.
when you get home and take the cover off of that beautiful thing, that pristine, beauteous thing, you can kind of, hey, I'm going to do this right or not do it at all.
Mhm.
And a lot of what's going on in open source is people who are doing it right or not doing it at all. And sometimes you have companies committing code, and then you have a bunch of people going, what horribleness have you inflicted upon us? Allow us to make that more beautiful for you. But I just find it refreshing. It's just in a world of sludge and awful hacks and things, open source is oftentimes a much higher quality code base than what you'll run into otherwise. And so it's nice to work on that. I also try as much as possible to provide value to people. Like, somehow I feel like if I've lived my life and it didn't benefit anybody, then what was the point?
Mhm.
And so I like to think that somehow I made the world a slightly better place. And if it was using open source to build a system that did research into genetic diseases, then the world was a slightly better place. And so that motivates me as well to keep working on this. And I think why do I use FreeBSD? Why ZFS? I I don't really have a good answer for that, other than it was just circumstance. When I said to a friend of mine a long time ago I'd like to learn Unix, he handed me a FreeBSD CD.
Mhm.
When I was in college and the chem lab was full of Sun OS machines. It's more circumstance anything as to why I use BSD. But eventually, you just get to a point where it's like, well, yeah, this could be any project. Like, I could contribute to Postgres or Linux or whatever, but I don't, and that's not what I've been doing. And so, there's a certain level of ownership that would just make it very challenging to just go, oh, the pencil is red, the pencil is blue. I switched it out for a different project, and it didn't matter.
Mhm.
So, so I think some of those things keep me motivated.
Okay. Well, you have any other hobbies outside of open source when you're not doing computer stuff?
I like to wrench on cars, but of course, some of the physical challenges I've faced with has put a little bit of a cramp in that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I still enjoy things that go fast or make loud noises. So guns and fast cars and open source software and computers. Like, I've often dreamed that I'm going to open like this giant warehouse, and I stole this name from a Steve Jackson game a long time ago. But Guys, Guns, Guts, and Gears, and just do
Mhm.
computers and guns and an auto speed shop, and just have it all be under one roof. Like, I think that would just be awesome. Like, be like the Gander Mountain of technology
There
geeks.
you
Just,
go.
anyways, but yeah, so I like those kinds of things. And of course, living out in the woods here in Wisconsin allows us to do outdoorsy stuff,
Mhm.
and do all that fun stuff. And I definitely enjoy that. So
Oh, cool.
Cool.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing that shop open up someday. I have to visit that.
someday.
I always love it when the guys cover a new release and FreeBSD 11 is out. But first, we got to talk about our sponsor, and that's TarSnap. You own the key, so only you can decrypt the backup. That's a key point for me. TarSnap makes so much sense and gives you true peace of mind. Online backups for the truly paranoid and for those of us that really know better. TarSnap runs on Unix-like operating systems, BSD, Linux, Mac OS, Cygwin 2 under Windows, and I wonder if anybody's tried it under Bash on Windows 10. I wonder if Alan or Chris knows. It's a really great system, and it's built by somebody that we know and trust. tarsnap.com/BSD Now. When you're considering backup for yourself, for your business, or your family, I really can't recommend anybody else. They're the ones where you truly own the key and they can't get access to your data. And they have a really intelligent bug bounty program that even makes payments out for things like cosmetic errors in the source code, which I think is a great system to make sure that there's always eyes on the code. Always people looking for flaws. It's pretty great. tarsnap.com/BSD Now. And a big thank you to TarSnap for sponsoring the BSD Now program all year. It is a great service, and it's the ones I recommend to my friends and family. Now let's transition to BSD Now episode 163, the return of Cantrell, and the announcement and discussion around FreeBSD 11.
But we have a lot of news to get to, including the new FreeBSD 11.0 release now is officially out. It's officially dropped. So if you had seen the earlier images on the FTP server, like, no, you have a new one now. That's the real deal. But tell us a little bit why that happened, Alan. What was the
Yeah, so as we mentioned the other week, a last-minute reroll to pick up OpenSSL updates, and then the updates to those OpenSSL updates, and bundle a bunch of other security fixes in with that. Meant the release ended up a little behind schedule. It was, I think, supposed to be October 5th, and it came out on the 9th. But you can now download FreeBSD 11. It will actually be 11.0 release-P1 to include the patches. That was mostly so that anyone who did download the old one will be able to update to this and have it correct. So that's good. And the release is better for all that extra effort from the release engineering team. But some highlights of the release are improved 802.11n support and various Wi-Fi drivers, including IWM, so that your Wi-Fi on your modern Intel laptops will work. Support for ARM64 has been added and is pretty much tier 1, which is a big deal for anybody that wants to do something like that, especially the Cavium server-style ARM64s.
That's nice.
Beehive has native graphics support, so you can actually run Windows installer and do it without having to do all headless. That was a big deal. For quality of life things, the flag in etc/tty's on if console has been set. So if you actually boot up and your dev ptyU0 is your console, it will automatically turn on, and if it's not, it won't. Allowing you to basically, if you enable serial console, you don't have to go and edit this other file. One of the big reasons this made a difference was obviously that when you boot Beehive in headless mode, it uses the serial console. And by default in FreeBSD 8 and 9, you would have to edit the image after you built it before you run it to actually let you do to have a serial console. Now the file's set up so it's automatically turns on if it's the console and turns off if it's not the console, which is quite nice.
Oh, that's great.
The XZ utility for XZip now supports multi-threaded compression. If you're making a large XZip of something, this makes a huge difference when you can use all 24 or 32 of your cores on your server instead of one. If you're going to do a ZFS send, don't pipe it through gzip, pipe it through XZip with threading, and it makes a big difference.
That's huge.
A number of kernel panics related to VNet have been fixed, so that features got more usable.
Speaking of which, we're turning that on finally in TrueOS now. Since it looks like it's stable enough, you can actually use PF with it. We're going to try and confirm that this next week.
The image activation config option for the kernel has been enabled by default, which means you can use the bin miss control to make certain binaries run through QEMU userland. So this is what's required to be able to use Poudriere to build packages for ARM and MIPS and so on your x86. So that's really helpful. That's actually in a release now. You don't have to run head anymore to actually be able to compile cross-compile packages at high speed. The generic kernel also includes IPsec by default now, and the resource control stuff is also compiled in by default, but it's disabled by a sysctl. So it's not actually running by default, but it's compiled. And if you want to use it, you just flip the kernel or the sysctl and it works. You don't have to recompile your kernel.
That's easy
I'd like
enough.
to see more and more of that as we get towards this never having to recompile your kernel for features kind of thing.
Yeah, it'd be nice just to have one kernel to rule them all and just not have to change settings. Like Alt Q, can we just get that? We turn that on by default in TrueOS. Like some
I just
people
use
need that.
DummyNet, so I don't need it. But yeah.
Well, but other people need Alt Q for PF. You know?
That seems like one that could be on by default. Another interesting one, you can now configure kern.os release and kern.os rel date for jails. So before you could install FreeBSD 9 in a jail running on your FreeBSD 11 machine, but when you ran uname in the jail, it would show up as an 11 kernel. If you ran uname minus capital U, you would see you have a 9.3 user land, but it would uname would report the wrong kernel. Now you can override those in the jail so that it will actually report that it's FreeBSD 9.3, and that can be a big deal.
Is any of that automatic, or do you have to override it?
It's not automatic.
specifically to
You
jail?
have to tell it that this jail is going to be 9.3, and then it will lie to the applications.
So you can use it to lie in other ways to the jail too. Like you think you're this.
Yeah,
but
so you can actually
you're not.
make it think it's newer, but that probably won't work. But you can definitely make it think it's older.
Yeah. Okay.
I know, some people still have FreeBSD 4.11 jails running binaries. They don't have the source to recompile, and that this will probably make that work a little better.
Nice.
Also, huge one for me, the minimum and maximum size of the ZFS adaptive replacement cache, or the ARC, can now be modified at runtime. So you can just be like, I need more of my memory back to run a virtual machine, so trim back the ARC. And then I'm done with that virtual machine. I would like more speed. Push the ARC back up. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's nice.
And of course, the chat room reminds me, yes, also the support for booting from an entirely encrypted hard drive is also there. That's some stuff I worked on. And then some things to watch out for that changed in FreeBSD 11. OpenSSH DSA key generation has been disabled by default. So if you do a fresh install of 11, there won't be DSA keys generated by your SSHD. When you upgrade, it will stop updating that key. So make sure you have your SSH keys updated prior to upgrading. Otherwise, you might not be able to connect. Also, support for protocol version 1 has been removed entirely. Nobody should have been using that for 10 years now. So hopefully that one doesn't trip anybody up. By default, ifconfig will set the default regulatory domain for FCC on wireless interfaces. As a result, newly created wireless interfaces will have default settings that are less likely to violate country-specific regulations. If you're in a different region like Japan, you'll want to tell it that so that it enables the use of channel 14 or whatever it is that Japan's allowed to use.
Sure.
And then there was that caveat from last week. An issue has been discovered with Amazon EC2 images, which would cause the virtual machine to hang during boot when upgrading from FreeBSD 10.3 or earlier to 11. The new EC2, if you do a new EC2 installation, it's not affected at all, but upgrading existing ones is affected, and you're advised not to upgrade until the errata notice comes out. That errata should come out any day now. The next couple of days it'll be out, and it'll describe or it will include the fix to allow you to upgrade your EC2 images and anything else that turns out will have this problem.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. So again, beware. Just give it a little time. That errata notice will be out shortly. Be patient.
I will admit, I have a secret passion for NetBSD, and I've heard of all of the crazy things that NetBSD runs on. But this was really something special. We got to hear from the NetBSD Foundation and how they operate and assist NetBSD behind the scenes.
This week we're joined by Petra Zeidler, who's a NetBSD developer. Thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
Hello.
Hello. So the first question we always ask people is, how did you first get introduced to Unix and BSD?
It's all the fault of Markus Wild, who in between 1993 and 1994, ported NetBSD to the Amiga. And NetBSD 1.0 came out with Amiga support. And a month after it came out, my Amiga was running NetBSD. And it still is. Which gives us the funny situation that I have a system that could drink beer in the US.
Yes, it's open.
And is older than quite a few of my co-workers. And it still runs my mail service and Usenet use. It is a Usenet a new server. When it started out, it was a UACP node. Of course, UACP is long gone. But if I wanted to, it used to be in the world map as Serpents, and these days it's serpents.de.
Oh, cool. So you wear many different hats with, between NetBSD and the EuroBSD Foundation and so on. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
When I joined NetBSD as a developer, well, not so much in the function of development. I had gotten an offer to become a developer before, but strictly speaking, I'm not very much into creating stuff. I need to be very relaxed to start fiddling with new stuff. Usually when I do something, it's, this bug dies now. So I was asked by Tracy DeMarco White, who was then the main admin of the NetBSD Foundation, if I didn't like to join admins. And that's what I did. So this is also still the main hat I'm wearing. To be on the admins team, usually if a new account gets created, or if users have problems or things like that, that's usually what I do.
Right.
I also do system updates and make sure that the packages that are installed are not vulnerable as far as possible. Which immediately led to the next hat I'm wearing, being on the package source rallying team. Because there were packages, they had a fix in package source head, and the latest stable release of package source was still vulnerable.
Right.
So you unobtrusively kick the person who had submitted the fix to head to submit a pull-up, and then do the pull-up, and you can stay on the stable branch with your service.
Right, and still get the security updates.
Yeah.
Yes, we have only recently finally had something like that in FreeBSD, where you could have the stable branch of ports instead of only having the head.
Yeah. Yeah, it's more convenient to have it that way because
no surprises.
If you have, for example, a Perl update in head, it gets to settle for a while. You don't have the situation that one package got updated and half the packages that depend on it haven't been fixed up to deal with it yet. Which you can get if you have something that is very down low in the dependency chain.
Yes.
So usually you have on the stable branch an economy that works together, which is very useful.
Yes.
Next hat. The NetBSD Foundation differs from, or the governance of NetBSD differs from FreeBSD. In our core is not elected. It's appointed and usually does not change. Our core is not concerned with membership questions. Core is doing exclusively the technical side.
Right.
Instead, the NetBSD Foundation is much more central. Every person with commit rights is a member of the NetBSD Foundation, and as such has voting rights for the board. And the board is responsible for making sure that the various committees are populated, that they are repopulated if they sort of die out, where most committees, the functioning ones, restaff themselves, which is fine if they do it. And of course, board is the one who has to distribute finances and do all the legal stuff. And I had been doing, helping with the board election several times in a row, where we use IETF methods that is, we determine a slate and that gets voted on. I have been involved with that process because someone had to do it, and I have the infrastructure to do it. And and then when I most unwisely was not involved in the voting, I got asked if I couldn't be a board member. This is how I came to be a board member. I'm now on my second term as board member. I had a gap between. I hope to get a gap between this term and the next one. And I'm also a member of the security team, which is, in my case, mostly a thing of doing imports for a new OpenSSL and things like that.
Yep.
And then creating the pull-ups to the branches, getting them through. And something where we've been somewhat slacking, but we need to pick up again, create advisories.
Right.
We usually have the problem that fixing it in head, snap.
Yes.
Doing the pull-ups, fairly timely, writing the advisory. Must I?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's currently, another hat I'm also wearing since we're at EuroBSDCon is that I'm the NetBSD representative to the EuroBSDCon Foundation.
Right.
Which, since I visit the conferences and then I'm a board member, and used to be a board member, was practical.
Yes. Cool. So what kind of bits of NetBSD could we blame you for? Do you have any particular piece of it that you had quite a hand in?
I don't actually create much, like I said. What I did create was I was one of the mentors for the IPv6 for NPF. After that was done, we found out a bit later that there was a gap regarding ICMP6, which is not ICMP4 with IPv6 addresses, but actually differs, is its own protocol. So I supplied that part to NPF. And then there's various, I wrote the original MBUF 9 amend page,
Right.
but that's a long time ago, and it has been replaced completely in the meantime. And apart from that, various fixes more or less around the tree, where one of my interests is networking and IPv6. So if something breaks there, I'm much more likely to say, okay, I'll fix it myself.
Right.
Than, if something broke in the scheduler, I'd be hard put to A, recognize that it did, and B, fix it, because I'm not a computer scientist.
Right.
I'm an astrophysicist by training, and it's not a question that I couldn't understand it, but I don't have the time to actually learn all that I would need to know to get that. And everybody who's still at university and misses the opportunity to soak up everything they can get their hands on is missing out.
Yes. It's each particular subsystem has a lot of context that you have to be able to.
Yeah.
And so it's much easier to focus on one thing that you're doing.
Professionally, when I met NetBSD, I was working at the Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy, officially as a doctoral student, but unofficially I was mostly doing system administration.
Right.
Which also was not so great for my doctoral studies. So I did not finish that thesis. Afterwards, I was at IT Services Company. From there, when the internet started to take off, I had been a board member of the individual network EV, which only was relevant for about 5 or 6 years, but really started off the ability for private persons to have internet access in Germany. And then it went bankrupt when all the commercial entities found out that it actually was a market. And was working at 2 ISPs in the meantime, backbone ISPs, ASR 517 and 1273. After that, when we had the ISP slump and I let go lots of people, I've been at an IT service provider as a Unix admin again. And at the beginning of this year, I started at the German aerospace agency at the IT engineering group for the Earth Observation Center, which is where all the satellite data from the observation satellites gets collected, archived, very important.
Yes.
And also processed.
Right.
Well, we come in advising people how to get the data from the satellite ground station to our institute, and how to present it securely to other people, but not at all in what algorithms to use to process them and so on. That's their job.
Just the same problem. You're just trying to.
Well, I mean, that's what they're doing research on. We have quite a few research students as well. So, also, of course, that's something that has a high squeeze factor for a geek.
Yes. But I think a lot of the viewers of the podcast are in a similar position where they're probably mostly a sysadmin and maybe were interested in contributing to a project, but
Yes.
again, they're not going to create the next new subsystem or application.
There's lots of stuff that needs to be done. Immense amounts of housekeeping.
Yes, and just maintenance, developers are after the big flashy, sexy thing, like building the next big thing, not keeping the existing stuff working.
Well, there's enough people who also do housekeeping both in the code and around, but an extra pair of hands is always a good idea.
Yes.
If you take things like, there's a typo in a man page. There's endless stuff, and better, I spent 3 hours understanding what the man page actually says. You could write that better.
Yes.
Documentation is a good entrance drug.
Yes,
because you have the problem that if you understand too much, you don't write good documentation anymore.
Yes, because once you know the system too well, you make too many assumptions and
you take
skip
too much
many
for
parts.
granted.
Yeah. And so, the FreeBSD Foundation had an intern this summer writing tutorials, and they had never used FreeBSD before.
And that great,
gave them, they could write a tutorial better than I could, even though I'm so experienced, because they have the same point of view as someone who needs the tutorial.
Yes.
Whereas my view is, when I look at it, I see a lot more, and I see it's almost as if stuff was transparent and I can see through it and what's happening underneath.
Yeah.
And a person approaching it fresh doesn't.
Yeah.
And it just changes everything.
The other thing is, as an experienced sysadmin, you probably may already know too much. But you also will know pain points, what itches, what needs to be scratched.
Yep. Because that's what I find very valuable. A conference like this is getting sysadmins and developers together, because developers often are writing these tools and they're like, well, I think this is what a sysadmin would want as the output, or which bits of information they'll need. And the system is like, well, actually, what I need is this other stuff that you've buried or forgot to include, or truncated, or whatever.
Also, obviously, different environments have different needs, and the greater your span of participants, the wider the reach of what you produce.
Yes.
One of the things I'm doing, quite a lot of things for NetBSD, is that one of my main machines is an Amiga, and supporting the Amiga architecture obviously is putting a strain on the resources. Not a big one usually, only when they update the compiler and toolchain, but it does put on a strain. I'm not good at building compilers. I'm a good sysadmin. I'm basically freeing up other people by supplying the work I'm good at, so that they can do the stuff they are good at and that I want.
That you consume,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more of that than people realize, is that it's about doing what you can in this place so that somebody else can free up to do the part that you want but can't do yourself.
Yeah.
And it's very,
I mean,
it is communal.
If I wanted to actually support the Amiga, I wouldn't be doing anything else, and it's more efficient for the project if I do the things that I do well, that I already do well.
Right, because you don't have to. You can do them at a much greater pace than someone else can.
Yeah.
And in their turn, they're more familiar with compilers, where you have to spend a lot of time learning and fighting.
Yeah. Where I'm, one of the things is, I'm I get stuff to break that works for everybody else.
That is a special
And
skill.
I have things working perfectly for me, but everybody says, "Oh, this is so hard and it's not working reliably." And so,
Yes. It works fine for me.
yeah.
And part of that's just use case or experience, and
Yeah.
sometimes that can be solved
Sometimes
with
it's
documentation. but
simply automatic assumptions what not to do.
yes, sometimes it's just by understanding how to use it, you understand that, well, that was never going to work. Why did you think that would work?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very interesting to try to consolidate those things and your view versus theirs and try
Yeah.
to think like they're going to think.
Yeah, but also more people with more difference in background.
Yes, more
give
varied
you,
people and people with different experiences. Or,
Yeah.
specifically getting more people that aren't the classically trained developer into these
Yes.
projects actually makes the projects that much stronger.
Yeah.
Because they can provide that insight and a view and just the different way of thinking.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's very interesting when you get people in the project that say aren't trained in computer science but in astrophysics or something that is provides a very different view of
Yeah,
how pieces fit together.
there are a surprising number of physicists around.
Yes.
I think it in part because of the training, because if you can get at the source, you can look at the source and see what is supposed to happen. If you can't, and there's still enough closed source that needs tending around, having the physicist mindset of, I have a hypothesis what should work, I try it works, great. It doesn't work, okay, let's modify the hypothesis, try again. And not give think I know how it's supposed to work, try it, oh, it doesn't work, I'm playing that now.
Right.
This try again, eventually gives you a result.
Yes.
One of the things that make a good sysadmin is to know what changes, what experiments you can make that you can recover from.
Yes. And also just, the iterative step of make one change at a time. So
Yes.
that when it does work, you know which change it was that made it work.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very important too. But I think the other point you bring up is especially in science, in the end, it's much better if the tools and the things that you use, software you use is open source, because then it's part of the science is you want other people to be able to recreate it.
Absolutely.
You want to be able to kind of prove the process that proved your theory, and if it's a black box,
It's even worse. You don't want to just have one result,
Right.
especially if you do methodology. You want to develop the field. If you can't give your tools to somebody else, you can't.
right.
So
And if you can't modify the tools to make them better, then
Yeah.
you're not advancing the science.
yeah. So since most of the people at our institute who are actually doing science are doing methodology, they actually are very huge on diverse geoscience tools. I haven't looked into them. I'm still too stuck up in the other regions that need doing. Maybe that over time I'll develop an interest in that as well. But probably not soon. We also have a team which are dedicated developers who look after that.
Right.
So it would be a side interest. Might find me packaging some tools if I ever manage to introduce package source to my job. But that's for the future. Baby steps.
But yeah, that was another important thing is a lot of scientists want to use a set of tools and use them, and it's very important that those be provided as reliable packages so that they can choose to use a platform like NetBSD or ABSD rather than just Scientific Linux or whatever, because when they get this R package for doing the math.
One of the advantages of using package source in this case would be that it also runs on
yes.
other. So you are not dependent on the US and we have a sizable amount of Solaris, for example.
Exactly, and you can use package source on Solaris and the derivatives like Illumos.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think package source is definitely an especially useful place to put that kind of science packages.
Yeah.
All right. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
If you don't have any questions.
I guess you had mentioned in Bulgaria that you have a setup with a telescope connected to a webcam. Does that use BSD at all?
No, I don't have. I have a very small telescope that is that doesn't have an automatic mount, and I have an ordinary webcam, and I put the webcam to the telescope, and I can shoot pictures with that. Simply by using bulk transfers from USB, but I didn't have to do anything special for that.
Right.
It was mostly just working. And since my telescope doesn't have an active mount and doesn't track the stars, I would have to do that manually. Doing any processing with that is not really practical. And the other thing is that the area I'm living in has too much light pollution.
Yeah.
So observations. If I got to have a vacation that was in a dark place, I could consider packing it and then doing some software processing of the images, doing fast snapshots and then shift and add and things like that.
I admit it, I'm a Linux user. I know it's a little weird that I'm sitting here with you, but trust me, I want to be friendly, and I want to know more about the state of graphics in BSD. We're going to get to that in just a moment. First, I want to talk to you about my favorite hardware server vendor ever. And I've worked for many years, 13 years in the IT industry, where I was ordering hardware from all the different major vendors that made x86 systems. Actually, I started with Spark systems. That was when I'm at the very beginning, and then transitioned into ordering x86 systems. And it was just disaster after disaster. When IX systems came around, and when I finally discovered them, I knew immediately they'd be a perfect match for the Jupiter Broadcasting Network. And I never dreamed we'd have a show like BSD Now at the time. They're such an ideal sponsor. They were really the folks behind MeetBSD. And so many I don't need to tell you guys this. I don't need to tell you. You guys know this. You know that they're creators of unbelievable systems, from the FreeNAS Mini all the way up to huge enterprise systems powered by those great Intel processors. You know to go to IX Systems, right? Go to IX Systems right now and check it out. ixsystems.com/BSD now. Go there, learn more about IX Systems, and dig around on their blog too. They have a great post about FreeNAS 10, which I got to see in action at MeetBSD with a ton of disks. I think Jordan was messing around with 20 or 30 disks. It was a lot. He had VPN'd into a system, but he had back at the IX office that he used for R&D. And it was super cool to see all of that. And you can see some of that in action on their blog. ixsystems.com/BSD now. Go there, learn more. And you can download their white paper if you need to grease the wheels up the chain at your business. And trust me, it is worth it. They had a great outfit put that together. ixsystems.com/BSD now. And a big thank you to IX Systems for sponsoring the BSD Now program and all of the hard work you guys do. Now, let's move into episode 143. We're shifting around in time and talk about the state of FreeBSD graphics.
Okay, we're joined today by Matt Macy, who's a random hacker of kernel bits, as he described it a moment ago, which is a great title. I should have thought of that first. But anyway, he's here to tell us a little bit about the graphics stack update that's just been announced for FreeBSD. So first of all, welcome to the show today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be on here.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
So first of all, we need you to tell us a little bit about yourself, since this is the first time on the show. We always ask everyone to tell us their BSD journey, what kind of got them into BSD in the first place, and where they first got involved. So let us know how'd that happen with you.
So we used FreeBSD in my operating systems class at Berkeley. Brian Harvey was teaching that semester, and that was pretty cool, doing something that wasn't the toy operating system like Nachos, which is what they normally used.
What version of BSD was that back? If you remember.
2.1.16, I want to say.
Okay.
So
Wow.
it's been a little while. Yeah, it was a different time because like the disparity apart from the fact that Linux had multiple distros, which Walnut Creek frowned upon, which kind of anyway led to many of this disparity. May have led to the disparity that we see today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that there was really difference between. I mean, in many respects, there was a completely different world in terms of the dynamic between FreeBSD and Linux back then. So
Sure.
And then I used it off and on over the years. Using 3 was actually kind of a serious headache. The ELF transition was worse in many ways than the problems the SMP transition in 5, because a lot of apps simply you just couldn't get them to build. I mean, everything was configuring for 8.out, and you try to build them for ELF, and they just didn't work. So I kind of slowed down my BSD usage, and then I came back to it later, more with 4, and then I dabbled in it some more. What kind of got me more directly involved was when I did the initial i386 port to Zen of FreeBSD, and drawing a blank on his name, the person who was the Spark 64 developer basically offered me a commit bit, and so then I sort of got a little bit more involved from there once that happened, and got kind of tired of Zen, but ended up doing a bunch of other things as well. So I got into networking some more when I ported the Chelsea driver to the initial Chelsea 10 gigabit driver to FreeBSD.
Okay.
Yeah. So you kind of already started, but what other kind of things in FreeBSD can we blame you for?
A lot of random things I did. Actually, it was. I consider it was really just FreeBSD 4, but it happened to be under the auspices of Dragonfly. I did the process checkpointing facility, and then just random performance work, lock push down in VM. So finer grained page locking. I took some initial work that Jeff did and got it to the point where where companies were actually using it, and then eventually Alan actually got that in, and then various work to bypass repeated locking and lookups in the packet path, and so changing just layer 2 and layer 3 to give better performance, and things surrounding support for multi-queue, Ethernet drivers. I sent you a list. I don't have to. You might actually refer to.
Yeah,
probably more complete than anything that comes to me at the top of my head.
Well, I see some ZFS stuff on here. Tell us a little bit about that.
I got it. I bought a OCZ SSD, in quotes, because they're so low end. They're basically just a camera flash packaged with a SATA interface, and they're basically unusable with UFS as a hard drive. But actually, with ZFS doing far fewer random writes, it was actually quite usable. And because of the write allocate nature of ZFS, it's a much better match to at least bottom the line flash. May not make as big a difference for UFS versus ZFS with newer better quality flash. But for low-end flash, where the reallocation of erasure blocks kind of dictates the rate at which you can write, ZFS is a clear win. And so anyway, that was why I got interested in ZFS, and also had a client using it. So it did some lock push down in the ARC, dealing with contention there, fixed some contention in prefetch. I mean, that the Solaris developers just didn't want to acknowledge existed. It was a very odd interaction there. But prefetch has never really worked right anyway. That was kind of a hack that they never really refined into something usable. And the big thing with it wasn't, it's kind of seems mundane, but it's to actually make core dumps usable under ZFS. Because with ZFS, the ARC will wire in huge amounts of memory. So the big thing that mini dumps introduced is that they would only dump, when initially core dumps would dump all of them, all of them. And then WEM changed it to mini dumps, which is just dumping wired memory, which is the kernel memory. But wired memory gets really, really, really large when you're wiring all of your buffer cache in the form of the ARC. And so that basically meant that it was often impossible to get core dumps out of ZFS. And so I added a new feature to just exclude pages that have been marked as no dump. And at least for a while, it made core dumps usable again. It seems like the metadata in ARC may be sufficiently large now that it's still exceeding many people's swap partitions. But anyway, it's a pretty uninteresting feature, but it's pretty important for doing debug to be able to get cores out. So.
Another one I've heard quite a bit about recently is iflib.
Oh yeah. So the idea behind iflib is that there's an immense amount of bad copy paste between network drivers, even at the highest levels. I mean, basically, only really, and sort of leads to, FreeBSD committers will come in and do performance optimization, and then the company's in-house software staff will go and remove them the next time they get an update from Linux and do sort of copy-paste. There's the standard copy-paste maintenance. And so that kind of makes performance less than we'd hoped for. And so iflib basically abstracts out all the device-independent common driver code, allocating queues, scheduling, doing TX cleaning, just the standard taking packets and passing them up the stack.
Sure.
And the driver is only responsible for programming registers or talking to firmware and translating a descriptor list into something that matches what the transmit ring or the can understand. And and on the receive side, all it does is, notify is when you're refilling the ring, you have a bunch of physical addresses, and it basically tells the ring where these new buffers are, and then on the receive side, and then when actually packets arrive, it just fills out a small descriptor that tells, which ring the packet is on, because, some drivers have multiple receive rings, which driver the buffers are on, and how big each of them are. And it's basically, it's not necessarily a trivial change to adapt a driver to use iflib, but it takes all the sort of performance burden off of the vendor.
Oh, that's cool.
And so we see much better performance, for example, and Netflix actually sees much better performance in much better worst case CPU usage on the Intel's 40 gigabit with IFLib than with their legacy driver, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, the thing we wanted to talk to you a lot about today was, of course, the hot item on everyone's wish list for those of us who've been in FreeBSD land for a while has been graphics drivers. And, of course, Haswell support finally landed in current, but heck, you can't even buy a brand new Haswell laptop anymore. That's how out of date it is.
Amazon, don't say that.
Well, you can't go down to your local big box store and be like, I'm going to grab a laptop. Usually end up having to be a
My
Haswell.
operating system doesn't support anything newer than 3.5 years old. Can you help me out here?
Yeah, right? But it didn't look like...
That's kind of why I wanted to do the driver work.
Sure.
Because I was at the NVIDIA GTC conference, and I felt like I had to kind of apologize for FreeBSD. It's like, yeah, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that, but, it really works well for some things.
Right.
And I find myself running Ubuntu because, big thing is I want to run CUDA, and there's no fixing that unless NVIDIA just decides to be, less, a little bit more benign. They're just not going to flip the bit and enable CUDA support on FreeBSD.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's what led. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. That's kind of actually what led me to do the DRM stuff. But
so what exactly was, besides just going to the NVIDIA conference, what was the reason for you saying, I'm going to fix this?
Well, it wasn't actually so much about fixing it as there's two factors. The first one was I discovered that that AMD has a slowly maturing alternative to CUDA called Radeon Open Compute, and that they actually have sort of a compiler, based on LLVM that will compile to their processors, their GPUs, but it also it can basically just transform it and pass it to NVCC, so you can actually compile it as CUDA as well. So once you port it to their stuff, you aren't tied to a specific vendor. With CUDA, you're basically locked into NVIDIA, and their marketing is such that they've convinced you that they're the only one that matters anyway. But at least now you have a sort of a cross-platform alternative, and they actually do have pretty good compute numbers. So it's a promising alternative. And so I saw that, and I thought, gee, well, that kind of addresses my issue. I can do GPU stuff. See, I guess what got me into the GPU stuff is I have developed an interest in machine learning recently, and a lot of that really only scales to large data sets when run on a GPU. Things like deep neural networks and various other algorithms scale and run about 10 to 20 times faster on GPUs than on even like a 16-core Intel, Knights. Even the top of the line Intel many core processor can't really compete with. Maybe within a factor 8 of a GPU that costs a fifth as much. So so for doing large scale data parallel compute, you really can't compete with GPUs.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of and that's important for machine learning. And so that's kind of what got me into CUDA. But CUDA is basically Linux only. And so I discovered the Radeon Open Compute, and that looked like that was promising and may actually converge with mainline in the not so distant future.
Sure. And
so I was like, gee, okay, but that requires porting the KFD driver, which in turn requires AMD GPU, which in turn requires a much, much, much newer DRM. And I was like, oh my God, this is okay. So that's the question of like, okay, so how do we get into updating DRM was kind of what the real first question was.
Mm-hmm.
And initially just updated to 3.9 with a lot of convergence with upstream and some Linuxification of the driver, and that was kind of our first step in vetting the Linux KPI as being a sort of valid alternative to localizing the driver. And then it jumped to 4.6 and went whole hog trying to basically make the driver as close to upstream as possible. No local changes. And
Sure.
the reason I started with i915 is because the i915 driver is newer and better supported than Radeon. So it basically makes sense when you're introducing a lot of perturbation, you start with something that works, and start with the newest thing you've got.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, I've gotten sort of more engaged more with i915 because, I mean, they've got 70% of the GPU market.
Sure.
And so there's no way of getting around the fact that that's going to be the GPU that most users and developers are going to have on their desktops or in their laptops.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it's sort of kind of just like with the GPU stuff, I think if the graphic stuff is a sort of a small but important step towards getting everyone back to dog food. I mean, I think,
Sure.
there are a lot of people, there's a certain amount of masochism required to dog food right now. I think it needs to get back to the point where I can use FreeBSD as a complete drop-in for Ubuntu on my desktop. There's no way FreeBSD can. Well, it'd be very hard for FreeBSD, PCBSD, to catch up with the polish. Having Mark Shuttleworth,
Sure.
dump hundreds of millions of dollars into it. There's just, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
It's just hope you win the lottery or something. But then when you win the lottery, you decide maybe you got better things to do with your money. But there's no reason why it can't be on par with respect to sort of common case device support, particularly if you have Linux developers doing the work for you.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea with this is not just about graphics. It's basically any devices that are better supported under Linux, whether or not they be like the Synaptics touchpad or the Broadcom full Mac driver. Any of those will ultimately be potential targets for quote-unquote porting with the Linux KPI, and basically just track the upstream Linux driver and just plug it into the FreeBSD kernel by way of the Linux KPI, because sort of device support is sort of one of the big things that's sort of really hobbling FreeBSD usage, and why you see so many MacBooks at FreeBSD conferences is because device support is just isn't there.
Sure.
And so I'm hoping that we can largely bridge the gap, and this is kind of an important first step. Mm-hmm. And it's being more of a headache than I'd kind of anticipated, because every laptop is its own special snowflake. You can have two laptops with the exact same processor, and one works and one doesn't, because of BIOS. How much memory the BIOS allocates, or how the BIOS enables you to enumerate interrupts or whatnot, and it's a headache. So it's kind of disconcerting, a little bit discouraging, because I kind of hope that it would be more like Ethernet drivers, where you make it work and you pass packets and you basically force out the edge conditions, and eventually you have something that's fast and stable.
Mm-hmm.
And now here, there's a lot more code to cover in terms of with the Linux KPI, various holes are being discovered, et cetera, and just a lot more complexity with the graphics driver, with people seeing like red lines at the top of the screen, and I don't know what's doing that. I don't really. Basically, it requires. So far, I've managed to get a lot of mileage out of just focusing on filling in the Linux KPI enough to make things go. But then when things go wrong, the question is, how do you diagnose what's going wrong? And that will probably require understanding the graphics driver a lot more than I currently do. But we'll see. So I mean, it's a long term, and so I want to get back to dogfooding FreeBSD on my desktop, which means that I can drive my large screen, 4K at 60 hertz, and if Vulkan. So are you two familiar with Vulkan?
No.
Mm-mm.
So there's a new. So AMD came out with a low-level graphics API called Mantle.
Okay, I have heard of that. Yep.
And it's for games development. It basically moves a lot of the resource management and scheduling out of the driver and into the hands of the game developer, which adds a lot of complexity, but it also basically frees their hands to make things work a lot better. And that's kind of what DX12 looks like, oddly enough, as well. And AMD, quote-unquote, gave Mantle to the Chronos group. So they're the ones who handle OpenCL, OpenGL, various standards like that. And so now it's called Vulkan.
Okay.
And NVIDIA, and it's sort of been eagerly adopted by the graphics vendors because it kind of undercuts the Microsoft games monopoly. Because up until now, DirectX has been far beyond OpenGL in terms of game support. And Vulkan gives the possibility to make SteamOS a reality, and running games on Linux and just porting them from Windows to Linux becomes less painful, and the results are better. And there are a number of companies that have actually essentially committed to doing Vulkan ports. And so what you're going to do is you're going to have AAA titles that essentially just work, that are fairly straightforward for companies to port to Linux. And so what that means is, by extension, is that you don't need Wine or whatnot. Is we'll just have the Linux API, and you can run AAA titles on FreeBSD. Which I'm not a big gamer, but there's something very cool about being able to do that, and it just seems one. And it's just sort of one step closer to making FreeBSD run. One more thing in terms of making FreeBSD run as a conventional desktop. Basically being able to run VMware Workstation, Google Hangouts, Widevine, which is the Netflix DRM, is binary only. Obviously, you're not going to have open source DRM, unfortunately. And so being able to have good Linux API support is important to be able to run Netflix. So that's another piece of getting back to dogfooding, is just being able to run normal applications. And so once, if I get the graphics stuff stable, I'd like to move on to looking at the Linux API, any Linux API disparities. And I don't think there isn't actually a lot that's changed. I think the big problem is that package management of Linux support ports is basically just too cumbersome right now. You untar the Linux port, or the Linux RPM, and then you make a port out of it, and then 5 days later it's out of date, and then a month later applications stop working because of something that's changed in the meantime. And so managing hand-roll ports of the Linux support environment is unmaintainable, right? And so I think that's fairly simple to fix. At least conceptually, is you take apt and you teach it to register packages with PKG's database, and you're good to go. And then you fill in any ABI holes that exist that have cropped up over the years. But I've actually gone through the release notes for every kernel since Linux kernel since 2.6.32, which was the CentOS 6 kernel. And there really aren't that many ABI changes that have occurred. I mean, I don't think their ABI has changed maybe even as much as FreeBSD's. I mean, so they've certainly added a bunch of flags to PR control and ioctl and ptrace, and they've had random things that allow you to read for one process to read another process's memory, which sound a lot like mock, but ad hoc mock editions. But I don't think that getting up to the point where we can support, Ubuntu 16 LTS's Linux 4.4 is really all that much work. I think the bigger issue is just making sure that we can keep the packages up to date.
Yeah, I think the only major syscall that's missing that a lot of people would like to have on FreeBSD is iNotify.
Is what?
iNotify? Like what Dropbox uses?
Yeah. There's FA Notify, and there's FA Notify.
That's the stuff that makes like Dropbox work and others.
Yeah.
Yes.
Somebody had a list somewhere of like the 3 or 4 that were needed to get Steam for Linux working on FreeBSD.
Pardon me?
Somebody had the list of what syscalls were missing to get the Steam for Linux client to run on FreeBSD.
Oh, definitely send me that, because I don't think that should be that. I mean, I found like 12 syscalls have been added in the last 6 years, and maybe 1 or 2 seem like they'd be relevant. I mean, they've added some stuff to part of the ABI now is sysfs and procfs, so they've added some things there that may be relevant in terms of threads can query their state. They've added various fields to procfs, but it's it's the kind of thing that you could do in a couple of weekends. I mean, it's not. Sure. It's not a lot of functionality that we're missing as far as I can tell. So, but definitely send me email if you find that. Again, definitely send me email with that list.
Cool.
So we cover the DRM motivation.
And what was required?
Yeah.
What was required to bring it up to date? So it's pretty clear by virtue of the fact that we've been lagging so badly on graphics support that having a native graphics driver isn't feasible. I'm not that interested in graphics per se in its own right, and I have no interest in maintaining a graphics driver long term. So really, I see the only way forward is being as close to upstream as possible.
Sure.
Because when I pass it off to Jean, I know it needs to require as little incremental kernel work as possible, and the only way to do that is to basically make it look like upstream. And so that's why I went the Linux KPI route, as I mentioned earlier, and it just ended up filling out a lot of holes in the Linux KPI. And the interesting thing is very few of the Linux KPI additions were changes between 3.9 and 4.6. I mean, 3.8 and 4.6. I mean, all these things existed in 3.8. It's just that we, had localized the driver, so we didn't have them in the Linux KPI. So the actual KPI usage of the driver has not changed that much since 3.8. So basically, what will determine the long-term maintenance burden of tracking upstream will be the rate at which it expands its usage of kernel programming interfaces, not the rate of churn in the driver itself. So if the driver is completely rewritten from top to bottom, all 128,000 lines, and every line changes, if the set of Linux KPI calls that it uses remain unchanged, there's no additional work for us.
That's awesome.
I mean, there may be an hour or two of reintegrating the handful of local changes. I mean, I have the i915 driver in 4.6 is 128,000 lines. We give it by comparison, the one in 3.8 is 62,000 lines, so it's more than doubled in size. And I have my diff, local diff is 450 lines.
Okay.
So I mean, it's not zero, but it's pretty modest considering the size of the driver. So
It's at least a manageable amount.
I mean, it's something you can look at, on a couple pages of text.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it may be able to manage that down further over time. Part of that's just AGP, making AGP stuff compile, and I think eventually I'll have to replace FreeBSD's AGP code so that I can support pre-Sandy Bridge laptops. Right now, the driver won't load on Arendelle, which is the chip model prior to Sandy Bridge, because the whole is in AGP. It was simply too hard at a first cut, to update that because it's being so heavily localized and doesn't sort of mesh cleanly with what's upstream. And so there's just sort of stubs there right now. And my take was that AGP is dead, but
Sure.
But there's some indication that Atom might use it, which is an internal bus on the system on a chip. I'm not actually sure. There's also just the support for Arendelle, so and prior. I mean, I'm actually pretty dogmatic about not supporting anything more than 10 years old. I mean, and my feeling is that, if you want to support anything, you want to support really old hardware, you can always just stick to an older release, or you can use NetBSD or OpenBSD. They'll welcome you with open arms. But the flip side of that is Arendale's not that old. It's 5 years old, and I think that does. Anything that does fall within that 10-year window needs to be supported. So, I'm not really enthused about that. I have the same feeling about Atoms. Is that they're such rubbish processors that and I think they may be getting killed with Intel's recent changes to their embedded. I mean, since they've essentially, their process shrink essentially failed. They're pulling back on a lot of things, but the fact is that it's out there and some people have it, and my whole agenda with dogfooding is that FreeBSD should just work on any arbitrary laptop, and I can't sort of say any arbitrary laptop, but
except that.
Yeah, that's not dickish. That goes beyond being a dick. That's to the point where you're just being hypocritical. Anyway.
All right.
So let's see what else.
I guess Alan's got the next question here.
Okay, what's your?
Well, we're wondering about the binary blobs that the Linux is starting to introduce for the graphics, where I guess it's like firmware that gets loaded into the GPU or something.
Yeah, so I've actually added makefiles for the firmware, and right now I haven't specified the voodoo for them correctly, so they're not actually getting found by the driver, but they're actually there, and they can be loaded. And so, we have Ethernet, anything 10 gig and above, Ethernet drivers all have firmware. And basically, any non-trivial piece of hardware has firmware now. And, even if you had it as C code, you probably wouldn't know what to do with it. So I don't really have any problems with firmware per se, except when it's buggy, which it often is.
Right.
But
I wasn't sure if we'd actually be able to just load that same firmware, or if we'd have to
the firmware, yes. So there is an open question about i965 support. Going into Gen 10, Intel is going to create binary blobs for some things. Mm-hmm. Is what I've been told. It's kind of come through a little bird. However, the same little bird is also pressuring Intel through the consumer side to actually support FreeBSD. So there's a good chance that there's a reasonable chance that Intel will actually compile the binary blobs for FreeBSD.
Great.
I mean, if the ABI usage of the binary blobs were small enough, it would be possible to emulate that. But emulating an ABI just it's not like syscalls where there's a fixed, protocol. I mean, kernel KBI is something that varies from, dot release to dot release, and that just seems nightmarish. I mean, ultimately, I want to settle on a kernel on whatever latest long-term support release goes for the user space ABI and KBI, but I mean, I don't know if supporting Linux at the ABI level inside the kernel seems like more work than one can really manage. But yeah, so now I think we're covered. I mean, the firmware is part of the build; it gets installed. I just need to fix the makefile voodoo, and we'll have the power management. There are no sort of OS level binary blobs yet, but we're going to try and have Intel recompile them for FreeBSD because there's sort of a general feeling that they claim to support FreeBSD, and FreeBSD is not granted it's nothing compared to Linux, but it's still probably tens of millions of dollars in terms of like network hardware devices and motherboards for FreeBSD. And if they refuse to support, with their monopoly position in graphics, if they refuse to support FreeBSD, they're effectively undercutting FreeBSD in the FreeBSD community. So, I mean, if they can with relatively little effort, facilitate the health of the FreeBSD community by allowing them to use Intel hardware for their own personal work and whatnot, it seems like the right thing to do. And it seems to make sense from a business standpoint to pressure them to do that.
Cool. Okay. Hey, Chris, before we get to the next question, I got to fix the audio. A little bit. There. I should fix it.
A little better now?
Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. There we go. So you put out a call for testing, asking people to help you try out the new drivers. How can people do that, and what kind of problem reports are you looking for? What information do you want back from users?
So right now, I mean, it's mainly just an issue of stability. I've got 3 panics right now that people have reported, and they look all fairly straightforward to fix, but I'm sure there are others.
Sure.
So in terms of testing, I mean, if you're running -current, it's not that hard to create. It's pretty trivial to just compile. Check out the DRM next 4.6 branch, and just compile a kernel, and boot into that, see if it works, and then boot back into your normal environment. If you're not running -current, I've created a bootable image that is a full-blown environment of sorts that has XFCE and KDE installed, and it defaults to using what's called SNA. On Intel, there are 2 modes of acceleration for Intel. There's UXA, sorry, I repeated myself, and SNA. SNA being the newer, more performant one. Mm-hmm. For some people, UXA works better, and the default. I have an image that uses SNA by default, and people can then switch back to UXA to test it. But kind of getting ahead is the basic idea is that they download the USB image, uncompress it, DD it to a USB stick, assuming they do they don't just shop at garage sales, or they've gone to the local drugstore lately and they have one that's big enough, they can just DD it and boot into it, and they're good to go. So basically, even a stable user, or even someone who doesn't even use FreeBSD, I take that back. FreeBSD, it would be a little bit cumbersome for a non-FreeBSD user, but this allows you to boot it on even a hardware that you don't run FreeBSD on. You basically download the image, and you create a USB stick with it. And you can just plug it into any hardware that you can boot off with USB. You can go and test, FreeBSD's graphics support on that particular hardware. Just plug it in, boot it, start X or start KDE, and
see what blows up.
and see if it blows up, or if it doesn't blow up, starts up, you see artifacts, or basically a red line, or fonts don't run right. It's all useful, and basically all those things. I mean, right now it's just make it not blow up, but I mean all the any sort of issues. I mean, you'd start out, just load the driver. If that crashes, okay, well that's good to know. If start X and that crashes, well that's good to know. Okay, X runs, but their things don't draw right, or it locks up or whatnot at some point. I mean, basically run your normal workload. Run heavy-duty 3D apps that, if you can, Stellarium or WebGL tests or whatnot. But just general, as much coverage as you have time for in terms of testing. And
well, the good news is,
don't tell me what goes wrong. I mean, there's not really a good test matrix like you might have for networking.
Right.
Sure.
And I mean, I really need to write up a little bit more about bug reporting. But at this point, it's just kind of like, tell me what doesn't work. And I've only gotten a handful of reports, most of which have been negative, which is odd since on my hardware it works okay. But I assume that people are less inclined to report successes. I mean, which is fine.
Sure. Well, hopefully we're going to get you a lot more responses here soon. I plan on pulling it into PCBSD's image for, we do a monthly current, and we're going to start rolling that this weekend. So we're going to pull in your changes and push it out with the June image in time for BSD Can.
Like, let's say it doesn't support pre-Sandy Bridge, so make sure that you have some mechanism for coping. Sure. Having a boot environment or something so that you can switch between the two, because it does have Broadwell support. It does have Skylake support. I mean, a lot of people are using Broadwell to good effect. I've heard a lot of people with visual artifacts on Skylake, so that's kind of disconcerting. But that's more. And also there's the issue with Atom. So just give people a backdoor for hardware that's not really supported right now. So.
Are all these changes you made just in the kernel by any chance, or is there any world changes as well?
There's nothing in userland. There's no userland changes. I mean, right now, ultimately, I think we probably need to be running the latest XF86 Intel. I mean, it's a library. For some reason, the X developers call it a driver, but it's not a driver. It's like.
Well, that was another question I had anyway. So what libraries do you have to pull in from ports?
Ultimately, I think we want to be running the newer X from the development branch of ports, but the reports I've got, I haven't had a chance to test that yet, and the reports I've gotten so far so that the current one in ports actually works better, oddly enough. Okay. So the stuff from my understanding is that the stuff that's in ports right now actually works best, which is a problem in and of it. So, but the gist of it is that you shouldn't really need to be doing, unless you have a Skylake that's much newer than what the thing that imports knows about. So the problem is that some of the Skylakes have PCI IDs that are actually newer than ports recognizes. So there are actually some changes just in terms of just recognizing the hardware on the user space side. But that's a fairly trivial patch. It's just adding, a half dozen PCI IDs to the libdrm or whatever it is that does the probing on the user space side to match up the PCI IDs.
Okay.
But other than that, and long term, we're going to probably want to update to the newest version of X and the newest version of the user space Intel support side. But right now, there aren't any, unless you have a really late model Skylake, there's nothing that needs to be done in user space.
That's good to know.
But that does bring us back to the sort of ports issue. Is that I have about 3 small changes that I want to push into current. Past that, just because of the amount of churn, I think the plan going forward is to maintain a Linux KPI, or at least my recent extensions to it, and DRM and the drivers as ports, and that sort of avoids the sort of issue with backwards compatibility for now, and it also allows me to fix things independent of FreeBSD releases. So basically, people can receive updates to it without tracking -stable or -current. Basically, you just every time you update your ports, you'll get the latest bug fixes to DRM, to Linux KPI and the drivers and whatnot.
Oh, okay. So that helps us avoid the issue of the window for commits to FreeBSD 11 closes very soon.
Yeah, well, I actually do have changes that I need to get in, and I think everyone wants those commits made, so
Yes.
Yes.
we can have graphics support without having to. The alternative would just be that everyone who wants, modern graphics on FreeBSD just runs PCBSD, because they'll just have my patches.
That would be an option too, and FreeBSD people, if you're going to make us do that, we'll gladly take the extra users.
But I definitely like the idea of having as much of it as possible be a port that can be updated, independently.
Yeah, because apart from the lack of having a commit bit, I think the bigger issue is I don't really want to maintain it in tree because of because graphics just moves much faster than FreeBSD does or should, and having to rebuild your kernel on a weekly basis as updates roll in, particularly right now since everything is in flux and we haven't really stabilized it. I think maybe by 11.1 or 11.2, the Linux KPI should have stabilized and we'll have support. There will be no loss of legacy support. Then it may actually be able to. It'll probably make sense to fold everything back into the tree. But so long as things are in flux and I'm actively fixing bugs, it's not really in anyone's interest to try and push the drivers into tree.
Okay. Sounds good. So I guess the next question here is, updating the Linux KPI, does that have any impact on the Linux compat layer, such as being able to run more modern Linux binaries? Does that work correspond to the ABI stuff?
Not at all.
Not at all? Okay.
So this is purely something that drivers fit into. The ABI stuff, it's possible that it provides some support functionality to the Linux ABI, but the Linux ABI, by and large, at least for functionality that FreeBSD has natively, Linux ABI just permutes the arguments in such a way that it can then go take them around and pass them to the FreeBSD equivalent functionality. So there's very little in the way of of work going on. But as I mentioned earlier, I do think the Linux ABI, filling in any gaps in the Linux ABI is important, and that's kind of part of my my personal dog fooding initiative, if you will, is that I see Linux ABI support is critical to supporting, running on the desktop, whether or not that's,
Well, you need to run, the Linux version of Chrome, so you get DRM and stuff like
Netflix
that.
or AAA games, Ashes to the Singularity, when that comes out. For Linux, you can run that on FreeBSD, yada, yada, yada. So, that's kind of it's just all, motherhood and apple pie in terms of getting people to run on the desktop.
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. Well,
Okay,
yes,
Al, you want to wrap
thank
it up?
you for taking the time to talk to us. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
No. Just looking forward to, basically, I'm going to talk about this because I'm trying to get as much feedback and testing as possible.
Yeah, I think we'll get quite a bit of more people interested with the podcast.
Because on the one hand, I've gotten enough. I've gotten enough responses that I'll probably have a day's worth of bug fixing when I get back to it again on Saturday. But on the other hand, I kind of, given how much a big a deal people have made about graphics support, kind of surprised how few responses I've gotten, given the fact that I've made it, almost push button.
Yeah,
sure.
Because I think that was a big deal, having that image that I can just plug into my laptop and not have to reformat it. Or, I plugged it into the NUC that actually we use to do the interviews on this show, and I can't go reformatting that. But I can plug a USB stick in it, boot it off that, try it, and see if it works, give you the report, and then the system's not modified.
Right. That's exactly exactly the idea. And it actually, I put a lot of effort into that, and particularly burned a couple days trying different permutations because of the glabel bug that you need to fix. But I've been through many iterations with that, trying to get something that something's moderately functional. And I'm kind of surprised that people don't seem not comfortable with it. I don't know, don't entirely understand it. I think, maybe it's just developers feel like they have to build it themselves or something, and that it's.
Sure.
I don't.
I don't.
Well, if it helps, I just threw the link to your announcement that went to the X11 mailing list onto the show notes. So I'm sure we'll have a bunch of listeners who watch it later this week and can now go grab your image and test it and hopefully give you some feedback. And I encourage all of our listeners to do that if you're interested in graphics at all on
If
BSD.
you want yours to work, you have to test it.
Graphics, just basically being able to, use something more, do something beyond just running with SCFB. I'm not interested in graphics, but I think it's sort of pretty important just to, if you're interested in modern, you're interested in running FreeBSD on any recent hardware, I think it's pretty important that you do this just for the general sake of FreeBSD health. Okay, well, thanks for your time, guys.
Hey.
Thank you.
Well, we appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. And, of course, we'll get some feedback for you here in the near future as well.
OpenBSD 6.0 brought in some brand new security features, like dropping Linux compatibility.
OpenBSD 6.0 is just around the corner. It looks like it's currently slated for September 1st, and it brings with it a whole slew of exciting new features, and we kind of have the early preview of what the tentative release notes look like here. So first up, of course, let's get this right out of the way. A moment of silence, please, because VAX support has been dropped from 6.0. And the one person who still cared, has picked himself up off the floor at this point, and life moves on. But however, to make up for the devastating loss of VAX, they have added ARM v7 to the release. So we do have a modern new processor.
With an EFI bootloader.
That's right. So not a big loss in my opinion. But anyway, Aside from that, the tentative release notes are actually pretty complete, and Mark 6.0 is quite an exciting release. So I wanted to go through some of those with you here, Alan. I think there's quite a bit of stuff they've done, but of course, as related to the ARM v7, they've added the EFI bootloader. Kernels are now loaded from a fast file system instead of FAT or EXT without the U-boot header, so that's kind of cool. Yeah, they have a single kernel and RAM disk now all used for the SoCs. Hardware is dynamically enumerated via the flattened device tree. So that's good. And then they have a mini root installer images that include U-boot 2016-07 with support for EFI payloads. So good stuff.
Lots of new hardware support I see here.
I know. I was drooling over some of this.
Even just GPIO controllers on all the new little Intel things like the Bay Trail and Cherry View. And lots of other little devices, including SMP network stack improvements for the transmit queues on the CN Mac driver as well, so you can get more networking, use more of your CPUs for your networking.
Well, hey, you bypassed, you can't not mention the IWM driver's gotten some more model support too. So if you have wireless 3165 or 8260, which that's what I have in those new X1 Carbons coming, is the 8260. I got to make sure, I don't know if that's been ported over yet to FreeBSD.
I know Sean Bruno imported a bunch of new firmware like yesterday or Sunday.
Oh, well, okay, good, because my laptop hasn't showed up yet. It's about 2 weeks out, so hopefully just
it worked on George Neville Neal's Sandy Bridge, or sorry, not Sandy Bridge, Skylake. He's got an X. He's got an X260, so that's the same newest gen, right?
Awesome. Okay, anyway, keep on going.
Lots of other stuff.
Let's see. So the wireless stack got some improvements. So the HT block ACK receive buffer logic now follows the algorithm given in the 802.11.2012 specs a little more closely. The IWN driver now keeps track of HT protection changes while associated with an NAP.
Yes, the IWN is the slightly older for the 6000-ish series of Intel wireless, like 6205 that I have in my X220 and T530.
That's right.
Other interesting one here is the priority field in the VLAN headers is now correctly set on each fragment of an IPv4 packet going out of a VLAN interface.
Okay, nice. I love installer improvements, ... So to be continued. There'll probably be some changes there before the release goes out. Let's see. They've added some routing table support to RC.D and RCCTL. And C got some improvements.
Security improvements. They have WXRX is now strictly enforced by default. A program can only violate it if the executable is marked with the special OpenBSD WX needed flag or is located on a file system which is mounted with the WX allowed mount option.
Nice. Okay, they removed systrace. They removed something else we'll get to in a second after the notes here.
Stuff we've covered previously. They have their SROP mitigation with SIG return can only be used by kernel-provided signal trampolines. And there's a cookie to protect it against misuse or reuse.
Nice.
And then I guess other big thing we have in the news here is the removal of the Linux emulation support.
Oh, you spoiled it. That's what I was going to get to next. But yeah, we'll talk about that here in a moment. What else here?
Just tons of stuff.
They got
new versions of
all their other ports.
Open SMTPD, new version of OpenSSH, OpenNTPD, the latest LibreSSL, etc.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff here. And then they, of course, list some of the outside stuff that's coming in. Looks like new versions of GCC, Xenokara, which is, of course, their version of Xorg. Bin utils. There's a new version of okay. Let's see, and then some highlights of some of the bigger stuff, like they have KDE, let's see, 3.5.10 and 4.14.3, and then different Pythons, Mutt, Node.js, et cetera, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the release notes here, so definitely check it out, although they might change a little bit, because this is the preliminaries before release September 1st. But speaking of this, in other news related to this, first of all, the pre-orders are up, so we should mention that. So if you want to go ahead and pre-purchase your CD, do that now. And second of all, InfoWorld actually picked up on this. They picked up on the story about the pending removal of the Linux compat layer from OpenBSD 6 and wrote about that.
They moved it from head a while ago, right?
I think it's interesting. Yeah. So people are just starting to catch up to this. And then, of course, with the 6.0 release, this will be official. But touting it as a security feature, of course, you'll soon be unable to run legacy Linux binaries on OpenBSD. So, of course, my opinion on that is it has both positives and negatives depending on your use case.
In particular, yes, OpenBSD's reasoning for removing their Linux compat layer was security, but it's because their Linux compat layer hadn't been updated in a long time, and so had all these problems. Whereas, well, not that I'm saying that the FreeBSD Linux compat layer doesn't have a bunch of problems that need to be fixed.
Sure. It probably does.
But
we are emulating Linux after all.
they didn't remove it because Linux is inherently bad or something. They removed it because there was no interest in OpenBSD in maintaining it. And so in that case, the OpenBSD policy is get rid of it because that way there's fewer attack vectors.
Get rid of the cruft.
I think the info world may be slightly skewing the story because of their lack of understanding, but
I believe so. But ironically, we're waiting for improved Linux compat support in FreeBSD because, from my perspective, I want to run some closed source stuff out there, like Steam maybe, or Skype, or, be able to watch Netflix, that kind of thing. So we'll see what happens with that. And of course, it was interesting to see that InfoWorld picked up on that. But we will keep an eye out because it looks like 6.0 is going to be a barn burner release. Lots of good new stuff in there. And we'll bring you the final, release notes once they get closer to September 1st here.
Yep. That'll bring us to the end of the BSD Now program. Don't forget you can follow the show at BSD Now on Twitter, but really, just subscribe to the RSS feed and get it automatically when it comes out. And the guys do record it live. You can get it converted at your local time, jupiterbroadcasting.com/calendar. There's also a contact page over there where you can send them in questions. And last but not least, you can also subscribe on YouTube to the Jupiter Broadcasting channel and catch the show that way. I hope you have a great holiday, and the guys will see you back here next week.